This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed.
Okay, members, you're all very welcome to a meeting of the Justice Committee. Today we have a range of issues that we need to consider. We have an oral evidence session with the Chief Constable. There's further deliberations on the bill clauses. We've the Department of Justice main estimates, the annual review of the Secretary of State's direction powers, proposed consultation on the development of joint secure and justice campus for children on Woodlands Lakewood site. Then there's a summary of responses to the consultation on the law on child exploitation, sexual exploitation and the next steps. Then we have the Department's draft corporate plan and business plan, and then the restarting the accreditation process for community-based restorative justice organisations and transfer of legislation. So we will get through today's business as efficiently as possible. If members can do the needful with any of their electronic devices, that would be appreciated. The informal deliberations on the provisions of the Domestic Abuse Bill will be recorded by Hansard in the normal fashion, and at this stage, if members have any interests, financial or otherwise, in respect of any business on today's meeting, now is the time to declare it. Then we'll proceed. There's no apologies having been received. Sinead Bradley isn't here in this room but is planning to join us through the Starleaf broadcasting mechanism. Also, again, I know Mr Beattie, for the second time in recent weeks, has received another threat from an illegal paramilitary organisation, just to assure him, on behalf of the committee, of our support and condemnation of those in which this threat has emanated from. Doug, I know you'll not be deterred from carrying out your important work. The draft minutes of the meeting that was held on the 17th of September, if members are content that the minutes are a true reflection of the proceedings, then I will sign them accordingly. Agreed? Matters arising. There are two items in the meeting pack, one item in the tabled papers that I just want to mention. Item 1, Domestic Abuse Family Proceedings Bill, the written evidence from an individual. There was one further written submission and that has been received, and it's there for members to note and can be drawn upon in our deliberations of the bill. Item 2 is the draft forward work programme up to the 1st of October. The Department wishes to schedule an oral evidence session on the October monitoring round at the meeting on the 1st of October, along with a written briefing on a proposed statutory rule to amend the Access NI filtering scheme. And it also wanted to schedule a written briefing on a draft consultation on the Modern Slavery Strategy 2020-21, but has asked for that to be deferred to the 8th of October to enable it to be presented with a briefing on the results of the consultation to minor changes of the 2015 Human Trafficking Act and proposed next steps. So if members are content, we'll seek to schedule the items requested by the Department for the meeting on the 1st of October. which, Christine, I'm assuming we're moving back to 2 o'clock meetings from next week.
Yes, it's at the end.
At the end of the business.
Or it'll have to be the either the 1st of October from next week, yeah, preferably, or definitely the following week.
Okay, so well, the working assumption is we'll be going to 2 o'clock from next week, unless I
Will that be
advise
starting at
otherwise.
2? I mean, previously we were starting at 1:30, so will it be starting at 2 or will it be starting earlier?
The problem being if a committee is ahead of us.
I'm not sure. We can check, but my understanding is the morning committees have to be out by 1:30, and the afternoon committees start at 2 to allow the rooms to be cleaned.
Okay.
But I will check. I mean, if there's a facility to start at 1:30 and the committee wants to, we can. But that's my understanding is that those were the slots that were going to be used.
Well, we'll pick it up later in the agenda on the meeting, but that's the assumption I had in terms of next week. But we can come back to that. Then the final item, matters arising. Police Service of Northern Ireland Retention and Disposal Scheme. The committee considered the Police Service of Northern Ireland's retention and disposal schedule at the meeting on the 10th of September. Members had raised no concerns with regard to the content of the schedule. However, it did request confirmation if the Policing Board had sight of the schedule and details of any comments or issues that were raised. The Policing Board has responded to advise that it hasn't had sight of the retention and disposal schedule. The PSNI schedule will be included on the agenda for formal consideration by the committee on the 1st of October. However, the schedule is subject to the negative resolution procedure and the statutory period will end on the 5th of October. And while there's been no indication that the committee wishes to pray against the schedule, if there is any reason the committee is likely to want to do so, the Business Committee would need to be advised of a potential motion from the committee in advance of its meeting on the 29th of September. The Justice Committee would then need to inform the Business Committee whether it wishes to proceed or not with the motion following formal consideration on the 1st of October. So, members, I had to bring it in at this stage because of the negative resolution procedure and the timescales associated with it. I've no intention of wanting to pray against this schedule. I'm content with its content. But we had sought that information and the Policing Board have came back to say that they haven't been made aware of it.
Okay, and had they any view of whether they should have been, or?
It hasn't been expressed. They've just came back to give us the factual position that they hadn't had sight on it. So members are content that we're not going to be praying against this schedule.
Chair, I think it'd be useful for us to look at it though in more detail.
Well, we did.
It's a very complex document. There's a lot of information in it. And it is an issue that has been in the media recently about the civil service and so on, about the
Well, this item was dealt with at a previous committee meeting when we considered it. We went through its content. It was just there was a member who had asked, had the Policing Board been given a view? So the committee did, from my recollection, quite extensively debate this. Okay, so item 4 then of the agenda is the European Union exit and justice related issues and key policing priority challenges, the oral evidence session, and it's for pages 12 to 71 of the meeting pack for the relevant papers, and the Chief Constable and his team are attending via the Starleaf facility, and they're going to provide an overview briefing on the PSNI's EU exit and justice related issues and key policing priorities and challenges. And I know members had pulled together some other questions as well, which we will get to in due course, and the committee provided that information in advance to the Chief Constable. So can I formally welcome the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, Simon Bryn, to the meeting, the Deputy Chief Constable Mark Hamilton from the Community Safety Department, and Assistant Chief Constable Mark McEwen from the Police Service as well to the meeting. So you're all very welcome, and again this session will be recorded and reported by Hansard and published on the committee webpage in due course. So if I can invite the Chief Constable to provide a brief overview of the EU exit and justice related issues and other key policing priorities and challenges that he wishes to draw to the attention of the committee. Thank you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Chair. I will say a few words just to get the record accurate. I am joined, as you say, by a small team from Brooklyn here today. Mark Hamilton's the Deputy Chief Constable and Mark McEwen is from the Community Safety Department. So between us, we'll do our best to answer the breadth of issues that are important. I thought, in terms of taking the opportunity just to bring the committee members up to speed with some of the headlines which I know are of interest to you today and the general policing context. There's a number of themes I thought it would be prudent to mention. I think firstly, it goes without saying we are policing in an unprecedented period since we were last before you as a committee. And I know perhaps as the day goes on, there'll be more detail around how we police the regulations, our relationships with the public, and indeed how we're keeping our own workforce going. One of the things I've been particularly impressed with, though, is the way we responded in the early days of this health crisis organisationally. We did collapse the organisation very quickly to put extra officers on the streets. And at the same time, we've now issued nearly 3,000 laptops as part of what was planned modernisation, but became sort of quite fortuitous, to enable us to effectively put 1 in 3 of people working in the back office, which keep the place ticking over, in that agile working space. And I think that's been really effective. Having been out a lot myself throughout the COVID period, and I know clearly this will be an issue for every one of you in your own community, I think it's worth also praising the resilience and the commitment of officers and staff during this crisis. Some people I will always single out are those officers that actually staff what we call the COVID crews, which are specialist teams in each policing district, which are at the vanguard of our response to any incident where we think a victim or a witness or indeed a suspect is suffering from the illness, and they're putting themselves at additional risk, and I think I'd like to praise them. In terms of the effect on policing, we can go into the detail later, but broadly speaking, we have dealt with over 12,000 COVID-related calls in this period and 1,500 interventions, which include things like prohibition notices, which have been more to the fore recently, and fixed penalty notices. In the coming days, as the regulations and guidance changes, our operational presence will be visible in communities right across the country, and we'll have particularly emphasis on policing house parties, and actually the change in emphasis on the licensing arena because of the new regulations, where we will step back more into joint inspections with other designated agencies than the stance we've taken recently. And clearly we'll be wanting to be visible in crowded spaces to encourage social distancing. Policing has not happened in a vacuum, as you know, and it's amazing to think in the summer months just all the issues we've had to deal with as an organisation and how this has affected the community, but also we've adapted. So it's included, as you know, praise, the policing of bonfires, the Black Lives Matter protest, the policing of funerals, and now indeed in recent days, how we police sporting events, which we may come back to later. The difference for us in terms of the policing challenge and complexity is that we are now having to police general work that you'd expect us to do, as well as the health crisis. And just to give you some sense of this, our 999 calls are now pretty much at the rates they were pre-COVID, but we're now having to deal with a rise in the virus. Antisocial behaviour has gone up a lot, frankly, and crime levels are creeping back to the levels that we saw prior to the virus hitting the country. So we're having to manage a lot of issues, which is stretching resources. It's easy to forget that we're under pressure, but also we've been bucking the trend. So, for example, in a general operational sense, drug seizures are up, weapon seizures are up, and we're doing more about investigating harassment, which I think is positive. And indeed, the number of people we're charging is up on a 5-year average, and actually 10.5% higher than you'd see in an equivalent organisation in England and Wales. Clearly, recent news has focused on the complexity of continuing to deal with organised crime and terrorism. I can't comment too much on the significant investigation into the new IRA, where 10 people have been charged, but also would highlight some of the increasing cooperative work we have with the National Crime Agency, as well as efforts here, which, for example, have seen 70 searches and 179 charges in relation to Operation Venetic, a UK-wide operation dealing with criminals that try to use encrypted phones. And indeed, I know it's an issue of concern to many people, and was referenced in your introduction, Chair, about the continuing pressure we're bringing to bear on paramilitary crime groups. And we've conducted over 50 searches in the last few months. Behind the scenes, though, and it touches on things last time, the mission moves on. So I'm working hard with the Department of Finance to see how we can look at different models to release us from the current estate that we're in, which is tired and old, and look at a new headquarters for the service over the next few years. And actually, and I think it is really important, particularly in the context of Brexit and COVID, that we continue to invest into neighbourhood policing. We're nearly at the threshold of 400 officers, which we promised a year ago, and the style is starting to change, with increasingly seeing people on foot, on bicycles, and problem solving in communities, and we may come back to that. More recently, because people say you never see the police, we've increased the visibility of the fleet. Big issues which I'll touch on today, but I'll just give passing reference before detailed questions, Chair, is we continue to deal with the issues of legacy which are unresolved, despite the hurt the families of people that have been victims of the Troubles feel, and we await clarity about what the new proposals from the government are. But as a key giveaway, I think, from my appearance before the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, we sit on 95 tonnes of evidence. So this is a significant issue, and just the breadth and the detail of bringing justice, if that's a resolution, or indeed bringing information to victims, just to give you some sense of it. Clearly, Brexit is one of the headline issues that you'll want to talk about today. It's fast moving. We are cooperating well across other parts of the policing network in the UK, as well as into the Garda Síochána and the rest of Europe. I don't think the prospect may be as gloomy as some people might think. Clearly, Mark, particularly today, will be able to update on some of the justice and safety issues and how we operationalise any protocol that's finalised following the 1st of January. The one thing I would highlight to you, whilst the Department of Justice are working closely with us, that we do have a funding pressure that's immediate in terms of a 4.5 million gap to actually balance the books for the commitment to fund officers to police the Brexit challenge. And obviously, as we don't quite know what it's going to look like, nearly 200 of those neighbourhood officers I talked about are actually supported through Brexit funding. And Mark will probably touch on later how we see them playing a crucial role, particularly in the border areas, to bring normality to communities if we go through change. A lot's happened in the criminal justice space because of COVID, but we're working hard to retain confidence in the system with the Lord Chief Justice, with the prosecution service and the courts to try and address backlogs, as well as harness the effects of new technology to speed up justice. Also, we continue to plan for the long term and are keen to see how the financing envelope that we're giving as an organisation may change in the next few years to help that long-term planning. And perhaps the committee might wish to consider whether we'll see any of the benefits announced in England and Wales for £60 million to policing and to designated bodies to police the effects of COVID, and whether you want to see that replicated here. Finally, in terms of what's been happening, it's not just trying to project what's been behind us and what's prospective challenge, but some results. So in the broader sense, we have a new community safety strategy, and that will be, a new community safety board, which I think we're seeing working increasingly effectively, which Mark may be able to touch on later, as we bring partners to the table to address some of the long-term and more enduring issues, and a new crime prevention strategy where we see prevention and problem solving at the heart of our policing office of the Republic of Northern Ireland. There is more to do. We learned a lot of lessons from the summer over the policing of bonfires and how we brought people to bear to share the responsibility for dealing with some of these complex issues. And clearly the Holy Lands reminds us that actually there are problems that go beyond policing. In the last few days, we've issued actually 40 fixed penalty notices since Tuesday and 12 prohibition notices in the Holy Lands area. So it continues to be a policing concern, but I think the resolution isn't a policing one. So I would call for your support in getting more people to the table to deal with long-term issues such as housing policy, licensing and the regulation of all of this, rather than really relying on the police to pick up the tab at the end. In terms of other issues, I think you may find interesting today that our clearance rates for crime remain stable despite the pressures of COVID. Recruitment into the organisation continues, particularly on the police officer campaign we were talking about when we last saw you. And equally, we've been doing work behind the scenes to make sure we're on our front foot for the next phase of COVID. And I've just completed a joint review with the Guards to look at lessons learned from all the effort we undertook in sort of March to the midsummer. And we want to make sure we bring that learning to fore in early challenges over the next few months. But I think I've said enough in that introduction, Chair, if that's useful to you, and I'll open it to to members for questions of the three of us.
Okay, thank you, Chief Constable, and that's very much appreciated. And let me join with you in commending the work of your officers and how they've been going about their duties over the past number of months, given the environment that we face. And you've highlighted the increased number of drug seizures, weapon seizures, making our streets safer. And in particular, I know a lot of praise that I've heard from people around the operation to deal with the new IRA, notwithstanding the live investigations. But I just want to put on record my congratulations in what you've been able to do in respect of that operation. We're going to just pick up some themes rather than have members jump in and out. So if we can break it down, we'll cover the EU exit issues first, and then we're going to cover COVID issues. Some of this may interlink with then some of the questions members have raised around, police resources and staffing levels, and then we'll move into just some other issues that have been raised. So on the European Union exit issues, what has been the kind of planning taking place for the resources that would be needed in the scenario where there isn't a negotiated arrangement, and have those bids been submitted, and is there indications that they would be met?
Well, I think it's two parts to that question, Chair, and I can bring Mark McEwen in as well if you want. But firstly, in terms of planning, it relates in the first instance to Mark. He's now here in police speak as what we call our gold commander. So in other words, the senior officer that I would appoint to look at all matters Brexit, both in terms of developing our strategy as well as monitoring the operational response, which, as you say, we will come to sooner than we may think. We have done a lot of scenario planning in the past, which we are refreshing because the environment is fast moving. We have been in conversation with the Department of Justice in particular, firstly to close the gap in the bid for the 300 plus officers and staff that we need this year to police the agreed challenges of COVID. And obviously, as we project forward into next year's financial plan, are in dialogue with the Department of Justice as well to see, as we get clarity in terms of the policing challenges, what additional resource we may need. But you will be aware that there's a people issue to make sure that we've got enough officers and staff to protect the public in any new environment. But there's also a lot of work going on behind the scenes with UK colleagues, with the Garda Síochána, and actually with other sort of key people, for example, the Border Force that we deal with, to make sure we're on the front foot. And I know there's historically some concern, for example, about the justice and home affairs issues around legislation. In the absence of a deal, Chair, I think it's important to sort of set a tone that whilst some of the resolutions that we are seeing and hearing about may be suboptimal, I think there's increasing confidence there will be workarounds if we have to go to that space, if we can't develop an efficient security partnership by the 1st of January. So that work is going on behind the scenes every day. But if there are specifics in terms of the effects, we can obviously take those questions. But whether it's the exchange of information through the Schengen information system, where that's used over 500 million times a year across Europe to check whether people are wanted or missing, for example, whether it's European arrest warrants, joint investigation teams, things may be slower. There may be delays, which are frustrating for everybody in 2021. But I think there is commitment to see that we make it as effective as possible. And you have to balance that against the volumes in terms of what we actually use these systems and these processes for here. But we can provide more detail if you want, Chair.
Is there any specifics around officers being assigned to do with community policing, supporting border force, that relates to the Brexit side of the planning?
Yes, I'm meeting the head of border force every month to look at some of the immediate issues. But let me bring Mark McEwen in, who's doing a lot of work at the moment to see the effects of Brexit and how we police not just the ports, but particularly the border area.
So thank you, Chair. If I outline broadly, the approach here is almost two phases in terms of EU exit. So we have scenario planning and plans in place, working with partners, including Border Force, around what we may see in the early part. So, the beginning of January here, the new compliance measures that may be in place and what that means, whether or not that will cause some disruption, some small levels of protest, or those types of scenarios. We have been planning with our partners to ensure that we have the right resources in the right place to deal with that and to assist the community and minimise disruption. And that goes so far as to plan along with other police services in GB, in Scotland, Merseyside, and places like that. If we consider then the somewhat longer term impact that the EU exit may have, we know already there is considerable uncertainty and concern in many of the parts of the community, particularly in border areas. There are concerns around the fact that some of those communities, particularly in the agri-food sector, may be disproportionately economically impacted. And that brings with it its own challenges in areas where that way of life is already challenging. So we are working with partners to look at what does our community policing footprint look like, what more can we do to support those communities, and what does that mean in terms of supporting our partners here, whether that's Border Force, health and social care, or any of the people we would work with ordinarily to provide a policing service. As the Chief has outlined, particularly when we think about the Justice and Home Affairs instruments that we have been very vocal, as have other services, in influencing the fact that we have communities that move across the border between ourselves on a daily basis, and that has been listened to and is very much being taken into account in dealing with those matters.
Okay, thank you. I know, Doug, you had asked for some questions in this area.
I can. Thank you, Chief Constable and Mark Squared. But can I just ask you a question? It wasn't on the list, but it's something that came up from the executive committee that I was sat on yesterday, and that is some parties within the executive thinks we are hurtling towards a non-negotiated outcome, and yet there is no executive-led cross-departmental working group to look at the non-negotiated outcome. So therefore, could I ask you, are you working, and at what level are you working with the likes of the Department for Infrastructure or the Department for Communities or DERA in regards to a non-negotiated outcome? Or are we all working in silos here at the moment?
No, we are working very closely with through our partners in Department for Justice, and that spans right across to DERA, Department for Infrastructure, to see what this would look like. As the Chief mentioned at the sort of start of this conversation, a non-negotiated outcome still means that we are working very closely with the negotiations around particularly Justice and Home Affairs issues. Setting aside the broader negotiations, there is a strong will from both the UK and the EU in terms of those instruments. So from a justice and a policing perspective, we are still playing a very strong role in those negotiations. We work with the UK-wide negotiating bodies, the International Crime Coordination Centre, the National Police Chiefs Council. In that, ourselves in Scotland have a seat at that table and are able to influence that, and as I mentioned earlier, articulate our own particular concerns around that. And whilst we look at then what the compliance infrastructure may be and the processes may be, we are scenario planning around that. It is our assessment that even in the non-negotiated outcome, we won't see a huge impact in the immediate aftermath in the early stages of January, but we're working very closely with Border Agency, with DERA and others to ensure that we understand fully what those compliance measures may mean, what that might mean for the road network, and we're liaising with associations such as the Hauliers Association and other people who are within our community who may be affected by this.
Mark, thanks for that. But I get the sense that you, as a force, are reaching out to these organisations. And I don't get the sense that somebody is garnering them all together with you as key stakeholders to create that overall sort of joined up piece. And I'll give you an example. If you remember before Brexit, and I know this Assembly wasn't sitting at the time, but before Brexit, we had a step-up ops rooms in every single department to deal with a no Brexit scenario. And I know there's a paper floating about stepping up these ops rooms again in a non-negotiated outcome. But I have a real concern that you, as a force, are reaching out, but I just do not see where we have got all our departments together, including yourselves, with justice, to make sure that we are prepared. And I have a genuine concern about that. Do you have any concern that this is joined up or not, at a higher level and not just at a police level?
I think we can always do more in terms of trying to coordinate and provide a coherent strategy, one that serves our communities and the people who are going to be affected by this. We do have, as I say, we have very good working relationships with the various departments and with An Garda Síochána. But I take the member's point, and we can always do more than that, and it's something that we can help to raise.
Mark, thank you. And I don't think it's just you can do more. By the way, that's not a finger pointing at the police. I'm talking about the wider piece. But thank you, Joe.
Okay, Emma, then Linda, and then Sinead Bradley. And if members can put the questions as succinctly as possible. So, Emma.
Thanks, Chair. My question is around the. In May 2018, there was a list of PSNI stations that were taken off the market, one of them being in my own constituency of South Down, Warren Point, which is a border community, which we were talking about. That was obviously, Newry Morning Down Council had plans to buy that station as a community hall for the local community group, and it was taken off the market due to the uncertainty of Brexit. Can you give me an idea of what the plans are in place for that site and the other sites that you have at the minute, and where we're at with that?
Do you want me to? I think the issue there, might come in on specifics, but we're actually looking at a number of decisions we made in 2018 to see are there opportunities to sort of go back into some of these buildings in the short term, but actually not just do it as us in isolation, and seeing where in places like you mentioned at Warren Point we might be able to use them in a different way. Because going back to Doug's previous question about joining up, we're really committed to try and look at a different arrangement for policing and community safety in the medium term, so that rather than just seeing it as a police station, we see it as a community safety base, because there could be other partners that we would want to have dialogue and contact with. And we're encouraging that approach from local district councils, as well as other people that would want to support us in managing any transition. And I think it goes back to the previous point, really. If you reflect over the summer, we have worked hard with other partners to bring them to the table, as Doug was saying, in terms of the Community Safety Board, the response to bonfires. But I've been, a year ago, I called for a Community Safety Board for Northern Ireland that had more punch power, and really we could do with something like that to join the dots up, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Linda?
Thank you for your responses so far. Just in relation to any discussions that you've had with the Gardaí regarding the continuing cross-border cooperation in the event of a no agreement end to the transitional period, and what difficulties or what challenges you might have in that event?
So we do have, as I mentioned earlier, we have very strong relationships with An Garda Síochána. There have been, as the committee will understand, certain issues around clarity and some political sensitivities about direct negotiation around our ongoing transfer of information and other matters within the Justice and Home Affairs side of things. As we have come towards the EU exit date, those negotiations and conversations, rather than negotiations, have stepped up. We have very strong relationships. As I mentioned earlier on, all of our negotiations around those instruments are done through the UK-wide negotiating, but we are able to influence that. We also have our own standalone service here, looking at matters of information exchange, currently the European arrest warrants and extradition matters and things of that nature. So whilst there may well be a GB or an England and Wales body formed for that, we will retain our own standalone system but be embedded within that, and that's the way those negotiations have been going forward. That allows us to maintain those very strong relationships with An Garda Síochána. The DOJ have been liaising strongly with DOJE, and that as well allows us to progress that. So that has given us some reassurance that whilst the arrangements that we talked about may be suboptimal, we will still have those strong relationships and still continue our cooperative working.
Just on the back of that, Chair, are there any GDPR issues, even in terms of the very basics of sharing information? So, for example, somebody is heading towards the border to try and evade being caught by the PSNI and they go south. Are there any GDPR issues around that? Even around the very basics of sharing information?
Yes, Chair. Those are all so the GDPR issues are being taken into account in terms of as we negotiate to replace the current mechanisms with something equally as strong. There are of course issues around data adequacy and those things that we are working through at the moment. But we're confident that because of the relationships we have, and as I say, we've made a very strong case through the UK-wide negotiating structures that actually a lot of the information sharing that we do, and it's true of many other services as well, but they are about missing persons, they're about lower level as they would be seen in the broader justice scheme. Issues, and we have those are the things that affect the daily lives of our communities who live along the border areas. So we've been very strong in that, and we expect that we will get a reasonable outcome and continue to work towards replacing what we have now.
Okay, thank you. Sinead Bradley.
Emma's question there about the Warrant Point police station. I was the member who approached the PSNI asking them to bring that particular site onto the disposal list, and Newry Council did talk to us at that time about the possibility of buying, but the conversation regarding the community centre has moved on. That said, I'm a little bit surprised at your comment saying about a community safe space. It may well still be the case that it would be helpful that the community had a space and then the PSNI could link into the community via that space rather than necessarily owning it. But I would like to look, I suppose I'm trying to understand the level of conversation that is being held at the moment regarding operational matters that will follow the Brexit. So, for example, and I'm just going to hone in on one because I know it is a particularly complicated and controversial one, is the European arrest warrants. So, for example, we talk about a suboptimal outcome and that there are negotiations trying to reach a system that is as strong as the European arrest warrant, although I've yet to hear what that is. But can you advise me what conversation is being held and at what level to discuss the actual detail? So, for example, one of the suboptimal options were the Norway-Iceland model. But when I look at it, that model references not just residency, but also nationality. So there's a minefield there in terms of honouring the Good Friday Agreement while trying to operationally run a model that is based on nationality as well as residency? And does have the PSNI foreseen problems with that? And if they have, who are they bringing those problems to? And I've heard a few times reference saying that you do feel listened to and that you do feel you're being heard. So if you could walk me through that one operational piece, the effect it will have, who you're talking to, what you're telling them, and why you feel reassured that they're listening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sinead.
Thanks, Chair. If you take a sort of spring to summer view on this, because obviously, whilst a lot of the sort of attention in the public spaces have been around COVID, Brexit has still been fizzing along behind the scenes, and obviously has now come more to the fore in recent weeks. So the start of some of this relationship, frankly, was opportunities some months ago now for me, for example, at one level, to personally brief the Prime Minister about some of the issues and risks as we saw them in a strategic sense. And whilst that briefing has some bounds of sensitivity, which I can't breach, that we were convinced that our message was heard. And then I know sometimes we don't want to hide behind somewhat opaque bureaucracy, because policing is good at jargon and sort of shorthand and acronyms for things, but there are working groups, for example, across National Police Chiefs Council, which link into Europe, which then will touch back into the Republic. As Mark said, we have operational dialogue with the people actually wrestling with some of the policing issues, broadly at superintendent level, that work, for example, to Mark and then his equivalent in the Republic. The International Crime Coordination Centre, which Mark referenced, is important as a clearinghouse, and we have people seconded there to deal with some of the sort of granularity of what does this mean and what does it look like. So, for example, wraparound alternatives to the arrest warrant do rely on the 1957 Convention, or do rely on what are called Interpol red notices, and they then have some detail behind them as to whether you can arrest or not, because before you can respond to a red notice, you also have to make sure someone's been circulated as wanted on warrant effectively in either here or in another country in a different jurisdiction. So there are things that we are working around, and that dialogue is quite detailed. Clearly, the anxiety you have and we have is we are still 3 months out from a finish line. All that we do know is that finish line is coming quickly, and there is lots of detail to tidy up. But it's something that now we have fresh eyes, frankly, because Mark's been brought in to look at this with a new chief superintendent that we've promoted to make sure that we've retested old plans, we're patched into the Home Office, we're patched into the Department of Justice, who, as Mark said, are also working in all sorts of different ways with different governments, that we feel confident if there's an operational imperative that pops up that we can address it. And just taking you back to the earlier comments you made about Warrant Point, we're agnostic about what the answer looks like. We just want to see increasingly our police stations being more accessible. And actually, if the answer is it's a community hub in which we have a space, well, that's something we can talk about locally, because probably over the next 2 to 3 years, those are sorts of conversations we want to have in a number of communities about how we change the look and feel of our police estate.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I wonder if, thank you, Chief Constable, I wonder if Mark would elaborate on that, a little bit further in terms of would the model that may necessarily fit for other policing partners across the UK, is there a recognition that there is a different set of circumstances here in Northern Ireland based not just on the land border, but the nationality question that can be weaved through these agreements if they should be used?
Yes, Sinead, and there is recognition of that. There's recognition around the sensitivities here in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and the issues of residency versus nationality, and we have flagged those up and they are being taken into account. They are, I suppose, unique to here in the fact that we do have a land border, but they are issues that do exist elsewhere as well. Across the UK and Ireland. So whilst they are recognised as being particular to us, they're something that is being wrestled with as part of those wider negotiations.
Right, Chair, could I just ask, just finally, could you throw some light on what type of resolutions are being considered? Because it's a big, big challenge. You know, the land border may be a shared issue, but the nationality issue and the rights under the Good Friday Agreement are not so perhaps well known or understood. So I'd like to know what are the conversations? How is that looking?
Well, I think the key thing there, Sinead, is trying to work out respecting the policing space in terms of operational advice and how we're pushing up into government, both here and the Republic. And I think some of those answers about preserving the Good Friday Agreement are matters for ministers as much as for senior police officers. And I think that's the resolution of that particular problem. And quite right, you raised something as sensitive as that. But we're, in that sense, we're here to advise the politicians rather than set policy. And clearly, there was still 3 months for those sort of issues to be resolved. But certainly, I think, speak for Mark, but we're confident that if there are concerns, there are mechanisms to raise them quick time at the moment. And clearly, as the clock starts ticking, we're going to scenario test over the next 3 months, increasing ranges of options, because you imagine this is a complex issue. And if that throws up issues either for us or colleagues in the Garda Síochána, well, we won't be shy to bring them forward.
Okay, thank you, Chief Constable. The last one on this section is Rachel Woods, and then we're going to move on to COVID-19, and Gordon's going to be the first question on that area.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your responses so far. Mine are two very brief questions. In terms of, you'd mentioned earlier on about 4.5 million in terms of budgetary pressures. Is that in general, or is that an outstanding bid from the PSNI to DOJ relating to Brexit?
That's a specific bid in relation to Brexit. It's we will be submitting that pressure in October. But it relates solely to that issue. I think the broader question, because there's more than one way to skin a cat here, isn't it? Is we're still keen on dialogue with the government in relation to the commitment to grow us to 7,500 officers, because obviously, putting Brexit aside, we actually police the streets with discrete different funding streams that all add up to the totals of roughly 7,000 officers that we've got at the moment. So in the short term, there's a pressure of 4.5 million. The previous settlement enables to recruit 308 officer and staff posts. So clearly, if that funding dried up, it's not the sort of amount of money we can just absorb overnight by efficiency savings, and it would probably affect recruitment into 2021, and obviously officer numbers and staff numbers.
Thank you. And lastly, just in 2018, the previous Chief Constable outlined security concerns that he had over Brexit. Do you still share these concerns in the current context?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you've raised that, because the bit we haven't sort of touched on this morning is that there are some very important issues that affect the whole of Ireland and indeed beyond that, aren't there? But I think we can assume, and we're doing close work with the National Crime Agency, who have conducted their own analysis, which we're patched into, that basically will say, as you know from perhaps the experience of many years, that criminals will exploit any gaps in sort of opportunities to raise money, because that's the motivation at the end of the day. So differences in tariffs, difference in the common tariff area, the movement of people, we are alert to that could all be exploited. So, for example, if you look at recent events over the summer, where we have focused more effort on the haulage industry, we are proposing to invest in the next few months different operational teams to see if we can skill up in relation to policing of hauliers, and equally we're going to increase the policing of the road network, for example, through the new ANPR intercept team, to make sure that we learn some of the lessons of the last 12 months, and where we can, we use intelligence to intercept, interdict and put criminals on the back foot. Similarly, despite the comments earlier around the arrest in relation to the new IRA, we're alive to the fact that there are still a small number of people that are influenced by a very poisonous and violent ideology, and that the Brexit narrative could fuel that depending on how it finally ends, and we're keeping a close eye on that with our security partners.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the COVID-19 issues, Chief Constable, and a number of members had put questions forward, Rachel, Gordon, Doug and myself, and I'm going to bring those members in first and then I'll open it up to others. So Gordon, two of the questions he was touching on was around advice to families in the organisation of funerals, and then issues around enforcement of regulations and prohibition notices. So Gordon, can I bring you in at this stage for you to put your questions?
Yeah, thanks Chief Constable and your senior officers for joining us today. We do appreciate your time and your efforts. And again, I would emphasise the good work that has been done, certainly within our constituency in relation to neighbourhood policing. I suppose, first of all, on the COVID thing, I'm fully aware that a lot of our neighbourhood people were taken on COVID duties, and more recently you've tended to move away from that. Will we see a bit of a reversal again then in relation to our neighbourhood police? Are we going to lose some of those resources again for COVID, as I would assume that those resources will be needed to be stepped up to, I suppose, encourage and enforce the regulations?
Again, that's a good question, and thank you. Well, firstly, there's a few bits there that to answer it and then come back, if you like, is touching neighbourhood policing will be a pool of officers of last resort for us. Now, clearly, we're as concerned as anyone else about the health prospects over the next few months. But if you compare where we were in the spring to where we are now, there are more bodies designated with enforcement powers. So, providing they step up and start to use them, that is a method of taking some pressure off frontline policing. When we collapsed the organisation that I talked about at the start, that was to deal with a scenario where we could foresee perhaps a third of the workforce being absent for various reasons, and also high numbers of mortality, sadly, in the community. Now, despite the current health risks, we don't see that at the moment. So I've been very clear in relation to my relationship with our other Gold Commander, Alan Todd, who's done some superb work over the last 6 months, that neighbourhood policing is the end piece of any sort of collapse of resources to support COVID policing. The other issue I think is important is that neighbourhood policing didn't entirely stop, and I saw firsthand, despite the fact that they were rostered to the 12-hour shifts to police the public space, officers continuing to visit victims of crime, continuing, for example, I went to a food bank in Belfast twice where the neighbourhood officers there were very much hardwired into that response to people of need. So, but we recognise, particularly from the review that we did with Garda Síochána, that how important it was to keep a community or neighbourhood policing footprint, and that will be important for us going forward. So that I would give you that reassurance that how seriously we take the investment in neighbourhood policing, the importance to eliminate distractions from it, and to keep our promise to communities. Okay.
The other point then is in relation to funerals. I suppose an issue that I've raised before with yourselves in May. I suppose I'm thinking more about family funerals and how the ability of the public or friends, relatives to attend those funerals. I still feel that there needs to be some further clarification on that issue, and I would appreciate your comments on that. The funerals are highly sensitive. They're highly respected and still within our communities, and people respect death, and I think it's a very good thing in relation to building communities and showing respect for those relatives and neighbours, as we like to do. But there's still a great fear almost within that people are unclear whether they can attend the funeral or not. So I would like some comments, I suppose, on that. My understanding is that within churches, funerals can take place provided there's social distancing. Outside the church, people are not sure whether they can stand outside, obviously respecting social distance. Some people have a fear of almost getting arrested going to a funeral. And the other point is just about walking in a cortege. Is that acceptable, provided people social distance? And are the police willing to do traffic duty, etc., in a local community where it is required during a funeral?
Well, these are clearly very sensitive and emotive issues, but I think something like setting a blanket policy on traffic duty in a local community is, in a nice way, is respecting the purpose here, Chair, is more a matter to be dealt with locally by the local district commander if there's a particular need, not to set blanket policy here. Similarly, again, the application of regulations and their interpretation are frankly a matter for the Health Minister and the team that supports him. There is a raft of guidance online for people to sort of try and help them make choices. You referenced yourself that the regulations that they currently apply to churches and the numbers of people that can actually gather outside. I think if there's any reassurance to communities, we've said from the outset that we adopt this 4E's approach, which I think is pretty well understood with people now, so that the last E, enforcement, is a last resort. So if we see there are issues, then we would probably want a conversation with people and encourage them to adapt their behaviour in terms of social distancing, respecting how difficult an issue this is. And it's actually an approach that we took largely over the summer months. But I think it's probably that's a matter for ministers to resolve in terms of clarification.
I think the police advice or instruction on it is useful, and people see yourselves as being the authority at the end of the day on whether how people behave within the street or how they can assemble. And I think there's still that fear and worry from the good general public out there, the law-abiding citizens of this country who generally do attend such funerals, that they are unable to do, and there's still something very prohibitive and sounds prohibitive about it. But I think give us some assurance that within reason it can take place, but and the police will, I suppose, locally, you're leaving it locally with commanders and so on, whether they will get involved in assisting funerals. Would that be fair?
Well, the local policing of any community, from whether it's a town or a small village, is a matter for either the district commander or the teams that work there. So again, I wouldn't want to set policy. I think one of our successes over the last 6 months has been the use of discretion and that band of 3 to 4 E's. Yeah. But I do have to stress, and I'm pointing to the comments made, I think yesterday, by the Health Minister about the place of policing in the COVID regulations. We are here to enforce regulations that are set by the Health Minister. We also have a raft of other responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, that I said at the start. So wouldn't really want to get drawn into the fine detail of how a particular funeral should be policed, and just encourage people to follow the guidance.
Another point, Chair, just quickly on COVID. I'm a member of the Economy Committee, and yesterday there was considerable debate about wearing of masks within supermarkets and shops. Do you feel the police could ultimately have a role there in encouraging, monitoring, I think would be good words, in relation to encouraging the public to up the wearing of masks? And it is a factor where the majority of people are wearing them, but there's a number of people are not. And can you do more to help in relation to see that there's proper compliance within the retail sector? I appreciate you do work with all the various organisations, chambers of trade and local representatives, but I do feel, and the point I think is coming, where we're going to need some stronger action from the police, if required, in relation to the wearing of masks.
Well, again, masks are a key part of keeping us all safe in appropriate circumstances, obviously, particularly in enclosed spaces and on public transport, so that we're here really to support other designated bodies and other people, because, for example, through the Gold Commander, as you say, there is active dialogue with Retail NI. We've had conversations this week with TransLink, who, for example, report high levels of compliance with the public wearing face masks on public transport. And I would remind the whole committee really that we have to balance where we put precious resources, so that, and remembering as well that in some instances people will assert they have particular reasons within the regulations and guidance for not wearing a mask, but we are here to support other people in that process rather than be on the front foot, frankly, because as I said at the start, we're now dealing with 999 calls that are back to normal levels. We're dealing with more antisocial behaviour, and crime is creeping up. So that we have a broad range of responsibilities to protect the public and communities safe. And clearly, encouragement by shop owners and retailers is as much part of the answer than the police stepping into this space where other people have shared responsibility. And again, I point you to the comments made yesterday by the Health Minister.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thanks, Chair.
Just a couple of quick kind of factual questions I would like to get some clarity on. 12,000 COVID calls, Chief Constable, you mentioned at the start. Just in a general sense, can you break that down as to what are the nature of those calls? What are people asking and reporting?
Well, firstly, the calls are coming in two ways, through 101 and also the new digital portal, which did take pressure off the phone system, frankly. And if it's slow time, we would encourage people to use that, and there's guidance on our website. The type of calls, we can give some breakdown separately to the committee if you want, but they've shifted as the environment we're working in has shifted and the regulations have shifted. So obviously, currently, if you project backwards, there are calls about licensing breaches in licensed premises. That clearly will change now in relation to the new emphasis given this weekend about house parties. And the general theme over the summer has been about gatherings, depending on the numbers that were in place at the time. So that they're the things that have that actually fueled the bulk. Clearly, there will sometimes be specific calls that relate to crimes and incidents where we know people involved in them are suspected or actually have COVID. And that will then trigger a different response, which is coordinated through a command centre here, so that we have to send the specially trained officers and specially equipped officers to deal with those calls. But we can give a breakdown to you separately if you want.
Okay, no, I'm just interested in the kind of general themes, but if there's more detail that can be given to us, yes, I would appreciate that. In terms of the fixed notices you had mentioned, I think in the past week, maybe it's specific to the Holy Lands, the 40 fixed notices. Do you have the number of penalty notices that have been issued from the commencement of these regulations, right at the very start from March?
Yes, I do. In terms of, there's different ones here, but the freedom of movement stuff, the Regulation 5, there's 517 on the latest figures they've got. All the other regulations are 145. There's some contraventions of Regulation 7, where there's 31. And there's currently, on the latest figures I've got, we've issued 34 prohibition notices, which aren't quite the same as a fixed penalty ticket. So taken together, the total amount of interventions with the public is just shy of 1,500 when you allow other methods of dealing with the thing. We have something here called a community resolution notice as well. So that enforcement has fluctuated at different times depending on the issues that we've been facing, and we keep a close eye on making sure that there is consistency on the application of those powers, because if like the issue of a ticket will always go through the centralised command centre to make sure that the approach we're taking is not treating people differently.
Yeah, and that consistency, I know it is important. The notices around movement, I'm assuming, has greatly diminished. That would have been at the very early stages. So it is in the other aspects now where there's a focus. And I suppose a question just on that: has there been any fixed notice on the wearing of or not wearing of face masks issued?
I'm not aware of any in terms of face masks, no.
And in terms of the parties that are taking place, if you want to just elaborate on how are the police going to be going about enforcing these new rules to do with people's restrictions on their homes, which is largely where the current proposals are. So, and that brings you into obviously tension. So there's very blatant breaches that will take place, and that's been evidenced by what we have witnessed in the Holy Lands. But take, for example, the number of exemptions that's in place for people's homes. You're allowed to bubble with a family. How would the police deal with a scenario where a report comes through that there's 12 people in someone's home made up of a combination of adults and then those that are under the age of 12, and they just say, well, this is my bubble. And then a week later, the same report comes through, it's a different family, and they just say, but this is my bubble. Are the police going to be investigating whether or not people have been truthful as to what actually constitutes a bubble? Do people need to register who they're bubbled with? Is it one set of grandparents providing childcare? Is it two? Because that's an exemption when it comes to childcare. So I'm trying to figure out, with these exemptions, how actually will that be enforced? And are you down to the honesty and common sense approach of the public when it comes to this aspect of people's homes?
Well, I think that's probably where we take up an answer for could, Chair, that the underpinning assumption in an awful lot of this, and who knows, we don't know what yet may come in terms of further restrictions and regulations, is to rely on people's interpretation of common sense, pragmatism and being reasonable, because we all have a part to play. Clearly, there is a tension for us in policing terms about, a concern, maybe like to previous questions about, is it safe to go to a funeral? We have to respect that as far as we can. We're not here to interfere with daily life and the tempo of people's, how they go about their daily business. Clearly, the regulations and guidance are increasingly complex in this space. And I personally have heard people almost seeking advice in terms of who's in your bubble, how you can go about picking children up from school and all this sort of complexity. So I think to reassure the public, we've got a balance to strike by coming down in an enforcement space against people that are just completely irresponsible. For example, antisocial behaviour, disturbances, house parties that got completely out of hand, which is the picture we've seen, sadly, in the Holy Lands over the last couple of weeks. And actually just people acting reasonably in other spaces. And that 3 years approach, if we are called to a house where there may be potentially be a breach, that initially it would be about encouraging and explaining the regulation and encouraging people to desist, because we don't want to be seen, if you like, as an army of occupation that's going through, burst through every door in Northern Ireland if something like this is reported to us. The contact centre that we have does assess the calls and either gives advice over the phone as well, or will assess if there's a need for police deployment. So we are conscious how people are concerned in the short term, because we've seen, if you go back over the summer, as regulations have changed, that how people interpret them, improve their understanding and moderate their behaviour. But the big bit for us here is to support the endeavour of the Health Minister to keep us all safe. But it is that fine line, as I say.
Okay, thank you. And I agree with the approach that you're taking on that. It's those that are blatantly breaking the law that undermine everyone's good intentions. In terms of the prohibition notices, the ones that have been issued in the Holy Lands, can you just explain to me what exactly is being prohibited?
Well, I wouldn't have details of specific cases in relation to that. The notice would, having seen one myself issued when I was out on patrol recently in Belfast in a licensed premises, they will prohibit certain behaviours. So in the Holy Lands, largely, it will be about indoor gatherings. I haven't got the detail whether any have been issued to licensed premises in and around the Holy Lands, but the notice specifies what the breach is.
Okay, and does that issue against the landlord as opposed to, there's the penalty notices that would go on the issue, but who does the prohibition notice be issued against?
Well, it depends who's breaching the regulations, frankly. So it will be the occupant if it's a home.
Okay. Let me bring in Rachel, and then I'll bring in Doug.
Thank you, Chair. I'll follow on just about prohibition notices. In terms of, obviously these will change now with the different regulations, but would there ever be a scenario that social distancing would be appearing on a prohibition notice, given that there are no enforcement powers over social distancing?
Well, I think it's the key thing, isn't it, that social distance is guidance. We're appealing to common sense, and obviously social distance applies in different contexts, doesn't it? We all try and social distance at work. There is clear guidance around use of face masks, etc., in in public transport, in enclosed spaces. So that again is complex and nuanced, but the guidance isn't an issue the guidance isn't something we'd issue a notice for. It's only for breach of regulations.
Okay, just to sort of tease that out again, in terms if there was a prohibition notice served and there had one of the reasons for it was not adhering to social distancing, is that something that the police can actually enforce?
Well, that's all about depends. If it's a gathering in a home and numbers is one thing, if you mean that bit of social distancing, but keeping 2 metres apart in another scenario may be something where we just give advice in the 3E space.
Okay. Fine, just on the bit of information that we'd received in our pack in terms of the breaches of the regulation by incident type, and that's from March to June. Part of that has 37% of the incidents for breaches of regulations were actually breaches of guidance, not regulations. Just wondering, maybe it's a comment from me more than anything, that the guidance actually isn't overly clear for a lot of people of what is regulation and what is guidance, but also how much sort of police time does that equate to?
I couldn't give a final answer to police time because different incidents take different amounts of time. So, for example, if you go back to the summer months where we were called to some of the beaches in Crawfordsburn and Helens Bay that hit the news, clearly responding to that would have taken hours. Other incidents we might deal with more quickly. I think despite best efforts, I wouldn't disagree that both individuals, listening to this broadcast, for our officers, indeed for the community at large, sometimes the guidance is increasingly complex and difficult. So that's why sort of reference to online tools to actually help people make decisions, I think, is important. It includes our officers because many different situations are unique and we need to get the balance right. And I think any simplification of regulations and of guidance, I think, will help everyone.
Thank you. I would certainly agree with that. And just finally, is there in existence any internal guidance for the police on the health protection regulations and how they're enforced?
Yes, there is. From the outset, we've tried to follow both advice from the National Police Chiefs Council and also from the executive here about how we operate across the estate in terms of social distancing in our buildings. And also, you may well have seen now, it's routine for officers on patrol and police vehicles to wear face masks throughout their shift, keep themselves safe and indeed to keep the public safe, so that we keep a close eye on that. We have regular operational meetings led by our Gold Commander Alan Todd that does receive the latest medical advice and opinion. We have now pretty strong cleaning regimes. We have significant stocks of personal protective equipment, a whole range of different scenarios, so that we're trying as hard as we can to keep ourselves safe, so that we continue to police the streets as well as not infect anyone else.
Okay, thank you. Doug?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief Constable. It's topical. I was going to ask it, so I'm going to. Can you give us an update on the investigation into the Bobby Story funeral? And I'm looking at this from a reputational damage point of view. Can we include how many people have been given letters to appear for interview by the police?
Yeah, I can give an update. Obviously, the first thing is not assuming everyone knows the whole story. So that since there was public concern, a lot of public concern about that funeral, we've appointed an independent Deputy Chief Constable from Cumbria, Mark Webster, to oversee our investigation into the funeral. He's supported by a trained and accredited detective superintendent and a team of officers that are reviewing different types of footage to see where there are potential breaches of the regulations at a number of different places. Having begun and are working our way through that process, 24 people have now received letters inviting them to make arrangements for interview with us in the next 14 days. Well, the clock's ticking, it's probably about the next 7 now. So we are in dialogue with those 24 people. And obviously as the investigation progresses, we can update further, but I'm conscious I don't want to say too much because you'll appreciate it is a live investigation.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. It is a live investigation, and I guess people are still really sort of interested in this because of the damage that it created in our health message during COVID. Have you any idea, Chief Constable, roughly when we're likely to see the end of this investigation, or is it just one of those things that we're just going to have to wait until it's done?
No, we're actually, because of the nature of the offence here, we're bound by a 6-month window to get the evidence to the prosecution service. So Mark Webster is conscious of deadlines and the need to get the best evidence, but also to submit it to the prosecution service in a timely manner. So at the moment, the best estimate is within the next couple of weeks.
Okay, and Chief Constable, another question which wasn't on the list that I was going to ask you, but it only just came up. Could you just, and it's a pointed question, could you just let us know who from the police attends the Executive COVID Enforcement Working Group?
Yes, it's ACC Alan Todd normally.
Thank you.
And just to tidy up on the funeral question, at this stage of the investigation, do you think it's likely there will be a report sent to the Public Prosecution Service?
Well, the way the regulation or the law works here is there has to be. So there will be.
Okay. Thank you. Paul Frew.
Yeah, just to keep on the theme of the Bobby Story funeral, can I ask also, is Mark Webster investigating the role or any role that PSNI officers played in liaison with Sinn Féin, the political party, in organising some events around the Bobby Story funeral? For instance, the sham oration in the graveyard?
Well, I think it is a live investigation. I think from the discussions I've had, the best thing I can say to sort of try and satisfy it is that he has had to satisfy himself of whatever dialogue there has been between anyone in the PSNI and anyone purporting to arrange the funeral. And that's about the most I can say at the moment.
Okay, just a question then from me around the enforcement of face coverings. That phrase sounds horrendous to me. There's absolutely no way that I would support the enforcement of face masks on individuals when the police officers involved will not know the private situations of any person and their health conditions. And we know in the past the police has got it wrong with regards to geography and where retail shops are and aren't in our hamlets and our towns. And I do think that the police would get that wrong also, especially when the guidance does not state that you have to wear a face mask in all occasions and at all times and in all places. And indeed, only if you can't adhere to social distancing and other requirements. Just on the police operation of wearing face masks, do you expect your officers to wear the masks at all times on operational duties?
Well, there's a couple of bits there, if I may. Firstly, in relation to the general public, we don't really want to be in the space of forcing someone to put a mask on, and I think it would be probably disingenuous to create that impression that we would use force to make someone do that. We would really want to rely on this three E's of the 4E approach. That if there were circumstances where there was a justified need for us to intervene, for example, on a train, to support a guard who's trying to ask someone to wear a mask, absolutely. But we also recognise, and quite right, that there are individual circumstances, and we will take those into account, which is why there isn't sort of an assumption that we leap straight to enforcement. In terms of our own officers and staff, in the public space, it will depend on the circumstances. So, as I said earlier, we're now sort of asking officers and staff to wear face masks in vehicles, because you would imagine for sort of 10-hour shifts or so, they are confined spaces. I was out with some colleagues last night just doing that myself. Equally, in certain scenarios, you will see officers wearing a lot of personal protective equipment, as I said earlier, when we're dealing with specific COVID-related issues. And frankly, as the officers and staff that work with us are as anxious about catching the virus as anyone else, in certain instances of close contact, they will be encouraged to wear a face mask as they deem appropriate. And if you saw, for example, pictures of a knife crime in Belfast in the media the other day, you will see officers wearing a mask then. We are not routinely saying in public space, if you can socially distance, you have to wear a mask though.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. I've been on record before saying that I have sympathy with the PSNI with regards to trying to police what I believe is very draconian legislation, and in fact we're actually legislating in people's living rooms. Not that they would commit crime in their living room, but even just the amount of people and the numbers within. And I just think that this whole legislative piece is very worrying, that we've had to go down this road. So I do have sympathy for the police trying to police this draconian legislation. But do you admit also and recognise and acknowledge also that whilst I have the sympathy of policing this, that there have been some scenes and scenarios where the policing of situations has gravely undermined the message, just as much as any politician for that matter undermining the message, and that has done grievous damage to the common sense requirement that is probably the one element that's saving most lives as we go through this pandemic, and that sometimes the police's inaction in circumstances, Bobby Story funeral being one of them, but being slightly different because at the heart of that, it was somebody's funeral. But other scenarios where there has been mass gatherings in Belfast, for instance, and then also in the partying around the Holy Land, which shouldn't take place at any given year, whether we're in pandemic or not. But the policing or the inaction of policing in those situations can really undermine the message and the common sense message that we need to get out there for people to protect themselves.
Well, I think it's an interesting point you raised, because quite fundamentally, I think you pick up that the regulations are complex. The regulations are passed by the government, and our institutional position actually is to support the rule of law. So that's the first bit in the Police Act that we have to abide by. If there are specific examples of it in action that you want us to look at, well, we can try and provide more detail. But sometimes we're asking officers to make very nuanced decisions, fast time. And in a complex organisation of nearly 10,000 people dealing with 500 emergency calls a day, sometimes we will get things wrong. But I've seen, personally, I've been out on patrol an awful lot during this COVID period about the tolerance to patients and the encouragement that officers and staff have gone through to try and support people going about their daily lives whilst supporting the spirit of the regulations, which after all are here to keep us safe and healthy. So that the broader debate of, as I touched on in my introduction, how we policed bonfires, parades, protest. Well, one of my reflections of policing here in the last 18 months that often we are heroes and villains. So action will go down well with one community and might be seen as less than satisfactory with another. And that's the difficulty we have sometimes in balancing the proportionality and justification of what we're doing. It's something that we will continue to look at.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Members, we'll move on.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Linda.
I actually have a number of questions that I want to put to the Chief Constable. And thank you again, Simon, for some of your answers. I think there's been some interesting points raised here today. And first of all, I am also on record. ACC Todd was here before the committee several times in relation to the COVID regulations, and on record as saying that I believe that the PSNI, in a very difficult circumstance, had got the balance right as far as possible. And as you've outlined yourself, there were certainly mistakes made, but I think given the circumstances that you were in, that mistakes will always be made. We're all human, and we have to accept that mistakes will be made, and where you can accept that they weren't blatant or there wasn't any malice intent, I think that it's fair enough to say that mistakes will be made. Can I just, sorry, declare an interest? Yes. I was one of the people who received a letter in relation to Bobby's funeral, the funeral of a very close friend of my family for over 20 years. So I just need to declare that interest before I go any further. I think in the balance, for the most part, in fairness to yourselves, you have got it right. I think the political and media pressure is maybe coming to bear, and that balance is starting to fall away slightly, because Everything we've heard in this room today is about Bobby's funeral, whilst we know that there were many other funerals where there was certainly, and the blatant hypocrisy in this room would actually sicken you. There were many other funerals where the rules were also broken, and that's okay. And the right approach was taken because the PSNI took a balanced approach. We've heard about the Holy Lands, but we haven't heard where there were other incidents at other events. And I think that students, again, and am I right? I suppose there is a question here, Chair, so apologies for taking a bit of time to get to it. Am I right in saying that most of the notices given out in the Holy Lands were not given to students?
Yes, broadly. I haven't got the exact figures in front of me, but we can get them to you. But the pattern has been, sometimes it's been students, but the bulk have been people that haven't been studying at university, but have been seeing people that have.
Yeah. And I think it's important to get that point out because students are absolutely being hung out to dry here, as though they are a law unto themselves and that there aren't very, very good students that are out there doing the right thing all day, every day. So I think that we need to make that point here. And again, that is not down to the PSNI, that is down to political motivations and media led. So to be fair to yourselves, that's not actually your responsibility. Can I ask also, are there any other investigations ongoing, and have anyone else outside of those who attended Bobby Story's funeral received letters in relation to those investigations?
Yes, the latest figures that I've got is that I think I've seen figures around 20 other funerals during the, if you could describe it as the COVID period. 13 of those investigations have now been closed because in terms of the fleeting nature of the breach, it wouldn't be proportionate to take action. There's, I think it's from memory, another 6 are still remaining under investigation, plus the one you referenced yourself.
Okay. And just then, in relation to the neighbourhood policing, and you've alluded to this yourself, the importance of it, and in your review with the Gardaí, which I think is really, really good and positive. And I think even in terms of going forward, and Gordon had questioned whether some PSNI officers would be moved back into COVID duties out of neighbourhood teams. I think we just need to reinforce the importance of actually the neighbourhood teams, and I'm sure you know this yourself, Simon, because it's something that I know you're passionate around, is the neighbourhood policing element. The neighbourhood teams play a really, really important role, and I know in my area where there was a wee period there where we didn't have a sergeant, it created some difficulties because actually the community built up relationships with these neighbourhood teams, and where there are then breaches of COVID rules, the community will speak to the neighbourhood teams where they may not necessarily want to go through the 101 or to the even to the app or the online way of doing it. So I think that is important. It's important to maintain that neighbourhood policing presence, and I would hope that would be something that would be focused on. And just to support what Paul Frew said around the enforcement of wearing masks, particularly within retail settings, I just don't know how the police or PSNI would get involved in that. I think it would be impossible. I mean, I'm not even sure that anybody who works in those premises should be getting involved in that, because there are exemptions to who has to wear a mask, and if you have someone with a learning difficulty that is not necessarily a visible disability. We heard from people on the radio this week who are deaf and who have challenges and difficulties around the wearing of masks, and many other kinds of challenges, whether it be breathing difficulties and different issues like that. And those who just take the stance that they are not accepting the wearing of a mask. So I think that we have to get the balance, and in this we all have to get the balance, the PSNI and all of ourselves as well, and we have to take responsibility in getting the balance, and the balance in all circumstances and all situations, not the balance when it suits and no balance when it doesn't. So I think, in fairness to yourselves, you have done quite a bit of good work there, but I would support Paul's comments around the wearing of the masks, and I think it would be impossible for yourselves, and I don't think it would be fair to put you in that position either. So.
Well, I think 2 quick responses, if I can, Chair. Firstly, both yourself and indeed the policing board, where I'm going shortly for another discussion, we've been very clear on a commitment that we would collapse neighbourhood policing, if you can see it in those terms, as an action of last resort. we don't quite know where the spread of the virus will progress over the winter months. But as you say, Linda, now I recognise how important neighbourhood policing is, and it's effectively one of the talismans of my leadership of this organisation, that we want to continue to invest in it, build relationship with communities across the country, and actually improve officers' skills to do that well. So I think I recognise how hugely important that is. And just to stress that, the preferred approach to most of what we deal with in the COVID space is almost that sort of phrase, just talk, so that where we do have to come into contact with people breaching the regulations, not guidance, we would prefer that there's a resolution that doesn't result in enforcement. And clearly the issues you raised with people having a whole variety of different medical needs that may mitigate against wearing a mask is something we'd be alive to when we're in any encounter.
Okay. Emma?
Can I just ask a question? It's just on a different theme. It was an incident that happened locally, and I just wanted to get your sense, Chief Constable, what it could be an operational matter, I'm not sure, but it was when a member of the public approached some of your officers with details of drugs being sold locally on a social media platform. The member of the public took it to the local police and were told they could do nothing with it. To me, this undermines the community police that we spent the last 35 minutes talking about. They were told, no, we can't use that. This person had went. They were very, very they were concerned about this. There was a array of different drugs that were being sold out of the boot of someone's car. It had the details of their name, it had the details of their car, where they were going to be, and they were just told, no, sorry, we can't use that. The person approached us and they weren't happy about it, and rightly so.
Well, thank you for raising that. I think actually, the response at first hand would surprise me and frankly disappoint me that we weren't keen on finding out who's peddling drugs in our community, because I talked earlier about drug seizures being up because we recognise we have to take that issue seriously. If you probably best if you want to contact my office after the meeting with details, and we can get that up with fresh eyes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sorry,
Chair,
Gemma.
I just have
Go ahead.
one final question. Thank you for joining us today. Just around we know that the domestic violence rates increased during the lockdown period. I'm just wondering, how has this played out over the summer months when restrictions are being eased a little?
Well, there's a few issues here on the domestic motivated incidents that they dropped, they peaked, and they're sort of broadly stable again. So it's been a bit like a wave on a choppy sea. I think the issue that I think is really important, that this is again a bit like neighbourhood policing that Linda mentioned, is one of the top priorities I've set ourselves as an organisation. And actually, Mark, who's beside me on the call, is actually leading some of our response to domestic abuse. I've said more than once, frankly, this is the one crime where we know who does it, so that we need to do all we can to protect victims and bring people to justice. So a small example of that is where we've improved outcome rates and charges for people that injure their partners in a domestic setting, so that we are looking at how we respond to the initial call, how we make swift arrest, and how we get best evidence to the PPS to protect people. But it's a thing we're keeping a close eye on, and clearly one of the undercurrents of even the most recent restrictions are the mental health and strain that people feel can lead to disputes within families. So we will monitor the issues closely. But broadly, we have seen some stabilisation in the incidents in recent weeks.
Thank you.
Gemma? Okay, members, I need to move on because the Chief Constable is leaving us at 12. That's when this element of the meeting will finish, and we have a number of questions still to get through. If we've got time, I'll open up to other areas that Ward previously notified. The PSNI resources and staffing is one of the areas members had raised. I'll just quickly recap on this and then invite those members in. So, Chief Constable, one was around a general question to do with plans being in place, if there are any, around rationalising police stations and upgrading retained buildings to modern standards. And you had already touched on recruitment issues That was an aspect that some members had raised about the recruitment of officers. I'm not sure if we need to cover that ground again, but if you want to comment just on the plans around police stations, and the other question on this was from Rachel around the changes to the police pension scheme.
Okay, well, I may bring my deputy Mark, who's on the call, Chair, to deal with the police pension scheme. I'm not sure he's an independent financial advisor, but I know he's been researching this carefully for you. So if I deal with the other issues first, certainly to reassure people that after the spring campaign to attract people into the organisation, the assessment centre process has continued. So we are progressing plans that we're still confident will achieve to actually grow the headcount of the organisation to 7,100 officers by the end of the financial year, which will be the highest it's been for some time. That equates to 7,000 real people, because some of the officers that work for us work part-time. We're also keen to continue to work with the government to increase to the 7,500 commitment that was outlined early in the year. In terms of estate, I think there's a couple of things. So I know police stations locally are always hugely important in the motive issues about signs of presence in the public space. So I'll come on to that in a minute. Broadly at the moment, and I'm working closely with the chair of the policing board on this matter and the head of the Department of Finance, we are assessing where across, if you like, the Greater Belfast area, we have headquarters sites. So for example, the one that I sit in at the moment, that if we came out of those sites and coalesced in a different place, still within the Greater Belfast area, could we sort of rid ourselves of some of the legacy of the past with a small L, in terms of many of our buildings are old, decrepit and inefficient, and look to see how we bring together the normal head office functions, if you like, the police college, a contact centre, and a new centre to tackle organised crime that will be similar to the model you see in Scotland. So those efforts are working quite quickly, and we're trying to see how we take advantage of the ability to borrow money in the current economic environment, and also, frankly, come up with a plan that will create jobs if we're able to begin to build a new headquarters estate in a radically different way. Secondly, if you see this as a 10-year plan, I think we all recognise that despite the efforts to sort of improve our state in the past, some of our buildings are more modern than others. I am the proud landlord, I think, of 185 porter cabins, which is not acceptable working environment in the modern age to have officers and staff working in. And we'd want to work closely with district councils in the next 10 years to see where we can make our buildings look less militarised, look more welcoming, and actually be assets that the community could use as well. That will take longer to come to fruition because of some of the changes we'd have to make to the environment in which we work, and may mean, on occasions, closing certain sites to build new ones still within a particular town that are more modern and fit for purpose, if we can get the financial support to do it. And I imagine many people on the committee or even watching will have their own examples of buildings that really don't reflect our modern values and how you'd want to interact with a modern public service.
Okay, before you introduce Mark then on the pension aspect, Chief Constable Gordon, you had asked around the police stations issue.
Yeah, I think that you've covered it fairly well there. Just I think it's important, I suppose we're aware that you have bids for future refurbishment and establishing the major projects that you've just mentioned. I suppose we're not fully aware of all of that, but I think it's important that those bids are put forward, and we would encourage you obviously to invest. We're fully aware of the porta cabin issue. You've talked about it, to be fair, since you came into that job. You've raised that with us on a number of occasions. I think it's important we continue to push that as a priority. I suppose locally in Northdown we have seen the rationalisation of a number of stations. We still have the Hollywood station now, which is virtually unmanned. I suppose there's a question mark hanging over the future of it, and I know the police use it for operational vehicles, but not for, I suppose, public use within brackets. And the Bangor station has had some work done, but probably needs further work. But we would certainly urge you to continue with your plans, and we'll do what we can to push for further funding for capital schemes, I suppose, and make sure that your premises are fit for purpose.
Well, thank you, Chair. That support's really encouraging because, frankly, we need the capital. We spend a small fortune each year on just building maintenance and keeping the estate going. And obviously, if we can modernise, we can divert a lot of that into either other services or other improvements and modernisation. But I know you want to speak to Mark as well about the police pension care scheme.
Yes, and finally, and I'll introduce the Deputy Chief Constable, the New Decade New Approach made that commitment of 7,500. Can I ask if the Department for Justice has formally put forward a bid to the Department of Finance for the funding necessary to give you the 400 additional officers that would be needed to fulfil that commitment in that agreement?
I don't think so yet. We submitted an outline business case in sort of management jargon to the Department of Justice, which outlined our reasons for why we wanted to grow to 7,500 officers. I'm not personally aware from any conversation I've had with officials that it has actually moved any further.
And is this an issue that you've escalated with the Minister to get ministerial support for this?
It's an issue that I've actually escalated with the Policing Board because they have an opportunity to advocate for us. I'm seeing the board in about an hour's time, not looking at the watch. It's a thing they're also supportive of and recognising their role to support us in trying to grow the headcount of the organisation to meet the agreement.
Okay. Deputy Chief Constable, if you want to come in on the pension issue.
Yes, good morning, Chair and members. And actually, further to the Chief's last comment on the 7,500, our three-year CSR highlight bid has indicated to the Department of Justice and therefore the DOF the costs that we would see in terms of growing the organisation each year over the next number of years to 7,500. So we put in that as an original outline bid just in our submissions in the last month or so for the 3-year CSR. Just moving on to the pension scheme, obviously, in the Court of Appeal in 2018 ruled that transitional protection offered under the old pension scheme, the new pension scheme, was unlawful, and has offered the government has now offered a remedy, which the executive is consulting on. There's a closure of that consultation. It now comes in the end of November. We're working very closely with the department to try and work our way forward, but basically they're offering a proposal of either immediate choice or a deferred choice to underpin to the members affected, and the members affected are those who effectively joined the police service before the 31st of March 2012. It doesn't affect anybody after the 1st of April 2015. We reckon that that's going to affect between 5,000 and 7,000 serving or former officers during the period. We're working closely to try and decide which is the best choice in terms of the immediate choice. And effectively what they're going to offer is whether or not you would take the benefits of the scheme of the old scheme, the prior to 2015 scheme, take those benefits from 2015 to the end of the remedy period, which is in March 2022. Or deferred choice, where you would defer the choice of that till the day you retire. So effectively what we have to offer those maybe 7,000 people is whether or not they want to avail of an extra 7 years on the old pension scheme or the new pension scheme. That's going to raise an awful lot of issues because every single person affected needs to have a financial statement given to them to help them understand which scheme would be the best scheme for them to engage in. And they need advice around that. And the two of the different options may have different tax implications for people. And also then there's a huge administrative burden for the Chief Constable and those who administer the scheme. So our initial sense is that we would be probably preferring the deferred choice, where we work out for each officer what is the implication for them when they retire, as opposed to trying to do thousands in one go in the immediate period after April 2022. There's going to be a number of other issues to sort out. So, for example, those people who have died in the period, people who've got divorced. There are also other issues, for example, that the pre-15 scheme recognises and provides for spouses, but didn't provide for partners, whereas the post-15 scheme does provide for partners, so there may be different choices for different people. And all in all, in our conversations this week, we feel that we could probably be dealing with the issue for maybe up to 30 years, Chair, in terms of managing out the pension calculation for each person who has joined prior to 2012 and their potential retirement date over the next 30 years and those who have already retired. One of the major concerns for us is going to be the capacity of the PSNI to manage all this. The date's coming along very quickly, and obviously this will all be subject to enabling legislation both in Westminster and supported in Belfast. And there's going to be quite an administrative burden upon us to provide the figures to everybody to make their choice at the appropriate time. There's also a view that there'll need to be independent financial advice for people available, and maybe independent tax advice for them to make the right choice to avoid litigation further on down the line if people feel that they were maybe advised to take the wrong mechanism. So the consultation will end, and we'll see what the final remedy is, but clearly we feel that really for over the next 18 months there can be a lot of effort in place to try and get us ready for the April 22 deadline, and then quite considerable effort to manage every member. And the last thing to note is the Home Office has just in the last number of weeks given permission to in England and Wales to police services to start working through the choice remedy for people who are about to immediately retire, because the court judgment said there should be no immediate detriment. So we're waiting to see if there's going to be any instructions to the Department of Finance here as to whether we should start to work immediately on those who are retiring now to give them the advice that they would need to make the right decision, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I suspect this is an issue the committee will need to get its head around as well. Rachel had asked the question, so I'm happy to bring Rachel in. Then I'm going to stay with Rachel, and I'm going to invite her to ask her remaining questions, which were on the domestic abuse bill, Operation Nexus, and the body-worn video cameras, because I'm aware we've only got 14 minutes left for this session. And then Doug had a question on Spithood, so I'm going to stick with Rachel for the next 3 questions, then Doug, and I suspect that will take us to 12 o'clock.
I'll be very quick. Thank you. That was very comprehensive. I'm just wondering if the PSNI has had any input into the current proposals that are out for consultation. Did you respond to the consultation?
So probably at 2 levels. So we were responding individually through our various staff associations, and then we as an organisation were responding through the Department of Justice. So we will be making our view known as to which way we should go forward with the immediate choice or deferred choice underpin. And as I say, our feeling is that we will be recommending the deferred choice underpin for the reasons of just administrating the process going forward. Chair.
Thank you. Then I'll go on to the domestic abuse and family proceedings bill. As you'll be aware, we're still looking at this in committee. Have the police had any input so far into the guidance that is being drafted by the department?
Yes.
That was great. Okay. That was a good answer.
Great answer.
In terms of just for later on, and the type and length of training that is currently given to PSNI officers, new and existing, on domestic abuse, how long is it for, and who runs it, and is there refresher courses?
Well, I'll let Mark come with some of the breadth. I think there's maybe 2 issues there, isn't it, if I've understood it right? Forgive me. So, when the bill is passed, we're looking at the moment of beginning training from December for about 3,000 frontline officers to carry out different roles. And that will be a mixture of classroom subject to the COVID restrictions or online learning, where we've had to put a lot of our effort in recent months. In terms of the specifics around training, it will apply if you're looking backwards around different roles, because, for example, the public protection teams, there's different levels of accreditation that officers have to achieve there, whether you're a frontline detective or, for example, a detective chief inspector running a whole investigative syndicate. That will play out in different ways. Clearly, then there's different training for custody officers and people who work in the custody environment around legislation, as well as for frontline staff. But I don't know if there's anything else you want to pick up, Mark.
Well, I think it's important to note, so the subject matter that we're particularly looking at in terms of the online training starting from December is around getting officers familiar with what coercive and controlling behaviour would look like, so that when they're dealing with incidents, they recognise it. We have been developing that programme with Women's Aid, and as the Chief Constable said, that will roll out from December, so that we have officers up to a certain level of competence, both in their day-to-day work as we go forward, but also in preparation for the bill. And then we will, in terms of preparing for the bill, we will go to classroom-based training with all the conditions that currently requires. And if that's still the situation we're in order that because we think it's so important actually to have that face-to-face training environment and those inputs from the partners that we work with.
Thank you. In terms of my second question then on Operation Nexus, is that in operation in Northern Ireland? And how is the PSNI operating this, if it is?
Yeah, sorry, it is an operation in Northern Ireland. It's part of a UK-wide scheme to make sure that we pick up people that are wanted in other jurisdictions and it could continue to cause harm in communities here if we didn't address them. So effectively, it's a check that's carried out in the custody centre when someone's arrested that runs through some of the systems that we were talking about early in the session around European foreign nationals that may be wanted in other jurisdictions. So it's about using it as a tool to keep communities safe.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that one when we've got more time. In terms of body-worn video, it's my understanding that after an incident finishes, the body-worn video was turned off, but is there any guidance on when an incident is finished?
I think I'll have to check the fine detail of the policy there. There is a lot of guidance in relation to the use of body-worn video. I think in relation to what we would say to officers, there are certain incidents where we effectively prescribe a must. So, for example, use of spit hoods, which may be a question your sense was going to come in a minute, Chair. Domestic abuse incidents, going back to your previous question, whether it's really good for gathering first evidence that can support prosecution. Things like stop search, motoring encounters, and so on. So we rely on officers sort of following that guidance and then having the confidence to use it in other interactions. From my sense, again, I was only out last night with some frontline officers. They see it as a really good tool, both to gather evidence, but frankly, also to protect themselves where they're accused, for example, of using too much force, being rude to people. It's something I'm keen to continue investing in as part of what we're calling digital policing. We're looking to renew body-worn equipment across the organisation to take advantage of how we could beam it using Wi-Fi back to police control centres and things like that. So I think the guidance of when it's finished, frankly, will depend on specifically what the issue is. So, for example, if you imagine an arrest, which would presumably cover the encounter into a police car, it would depend on the circumstances and what equipment's also available in a car. Because, for example, some of our cell vans are equipped with cameras about when officers would choose to continue filming to protect both themselves and the person they've arrested. So it's not always an exact science, but then we would debrief incidents quickly to make sure we get evidence into the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Doug?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief Constable. I was going to ask you a question on spit hoods, but we're short on time, so I think I'll write to you on that one. So okay. I'll leave that. And I hope that the Chair won't mind my liberty of asking you a slightly different question. I've had a real influx of police officers and former police officers who are concerned about the police injured on duty assessment procedures. Can you explain where we are in regards to that in a minute? Because a lot of them are complaining the fact is that the IMRs are not taking place. They're saying due to COVID, yet they are happening with the Northern Ireland Police Service. And they're also concerned that privately employed professionals who deal with mental health care are not being listened to by the SNPs.
Yeah, well, funny enough, I know this is a really live and important issue for all sorts of reasons, Doug, because of colleagues that are suffering a range of issues because of their commitment to service in the past. As you know, it will tend to be for issues like PTSD or sort of mobility issues caused by musculoskeletal problems. The application of the scheme, though, whilst we recognise it's important, we recognise it's slowed down because of COVID, is actually a matter for the policing board. We just give advice, so that those bits of detail, something you probably would have to get a response from the chair or the chief executive, frankly.
Okay, and I guess that's a fair response. But I suppose maybe I was just trying to get your view on it, Chief Constable. I mean, you're absolutely quite right that this is incredibly important, and COVID has not made it easier. But I guess it's your view on whether these people are being best served by the current procedure or not. And I know it's just a view, that's all I'm asking for.
Okay. Well, I think there's a couple of things. Clearly, there was a report, there have been a number of issues around this, because in one sense, in terms of, if you like, the macro picture, the management of the public purse, this scheme is expensive. And I know there's been a previous concern about the amount of public money the scheme is consuming. And indeed, how on occasions individuals may almost seek to exploit the scheme for their own benefit. Well, we wouldn't continue or condone gaming a system that's meant to protect officers that sadly can't continue to work because of life-limiting conditions, or the sort of things I talked about. I think, in broad brush terms, I would like to see a scheme that's fair and equitable, but also is a lot faster. I think if you imagine if you are someone that's actually trying to work with the rules, that is suffering, for example, from PTSD, can't work anymore, and just wants to exit the police to try and remedy some of the issues that are troubling them. I think if we can speed that up and bring that service to a conclusion to the benefit of all parties, that will be success for me.
Yeah, thanks, Chief Constable. And maybe I'll write you and we'll see if we can organise a meeting with some of your officials just to maybe talk some of it through. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We have 2 minutes left, so Linda Dillon.
Just for Doug's information, the Policing Board actually had a specific working group around that issue, and it might be beneficial for you to maybe meet with them. That they probably could answer more of the questions than that.
And if I can, Linda, you're right, and I do know that. Some of the complaints I'm getting is about how that working group is applying some of the outworkings of it. For example, I'm getting people complaining and saying that a medical professional saying somebody is going off and should be a band 4, but that working group is deciding they're a band 2. And so there's a concern. So you're right.
Is there anything for the Chief Constable?
Yes.
Sorry.
Chief Constable, can I just ask, in relation to the Black Lives Matter protest, PSNI used Section 44 of the Serious Crime Act 2007 to caution a number of those involved with the protest on the 6th of June. The Serious Crime Act obviously is what it says. It's supposed to be intended to be used for serious crime. Do you think that the use of the section in relation to a peaceful protest was appropriate and proportionate?
Well, I think I would be careful here, because obviously, again, this is in some sense for some people a prosecution that's been in process, and I think in a number of cases files have now been submitted to the PPS. I think I'm doing this from memory, but I think another one someone accepted a caution. So that we will also be answering some detailed questions in relation to this next week at the board. It is also tied into the general examination of the Black Lives Matter protest, Linda, by the Ombudsman. So in terms of appropriateness and proportionality, I'll be a bit wary of giving an answer at the moment until she's finished her conclusions. But obviously can discuss that at a further committee or at the board once we've had our conclusions, which we anticipate in the next few weeks.
At the board, that's fine. Leave it with the board. Thank you.
Finally, no one else. If I can just put on your radar, Chief Constable, I've spoken to my own district commander about this. I've spoken to the head of the prison service, and I raised it with the Justice Minister about the planned protest and camp at Maghaberry Prison, and I've made my views clear to all of those individuals. My view is that there should be no facilitation whatsoever of what is planned, and it would severely undermine any confidence in other regulations if this protest or camp was facilitated, and have a constituency interest there, because nobody in the village that I represent, Magabry, wants this to be facilitated by the police. So I'm putting it on your radar. I appreciate there's operational decisions to be taken in respect of that. Hopefully it comes to nothing anyway. Sometimes these things do, and it's just flagged up in social media and so on, but I'm just putting that out there, that's my view on the matter.
Yeah, I think I have heard those views, frankly, Chair, and it is likely to be one of a number of protests we'll be dealing with over the weekend.
Well, Chief Constable, can I thank you and your team for taking the time with us. We've spent a good 2 hours going through a wide range of issues, and as always, that's very much appreciated. There'll be some work streams, I think, that we'll want to pick up with the Department of Justice as well on this in due course. But for now, thank you and best wishes to you and your colleagues.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, members, just in terms of time frame for how we're proceeding, obviously we're getting into the bill discussions now. We have to finish this meeting at 1:30. We have another room booked to continue the meeting at 2 o'clock to allow members an opportunity to have lunch. That is if we don't get through the business in the next 90 minutes. But provision has been made for another committee room to be used by members, because we have a duty to report and we can't delay the responsibilities on it. So if members are able to work with me, I'll try and get it concluded, that we don't need to meet this afternoon, but that is the contingency plan if that becomes necessary. Okay, well then let's go into item 5 on the agenda then, which is the Domestic Abuse Family Proceedings Bill. So members, please bear with me, and at times I might get Christine to provide some information around this as well, and I again acknowledge some of the lateness of consideration around amendments and so on, but we are where we are. So at the pages that we're looking at here, 79 to 147 of your meeting pack, and then also pages 95 to 145 of the tabled pack. At last week's meeting, the committee discussed further information that was provided by the department on a number of the clauses in the bill. The committee agreed to request further clarification from the department in relation to the term affinity and the text of the proposed departmental amendments for this meeting to enable the committee to complete its deliberations on the provisions of the bill. The committee also agreed to seek the views of the department on a potential amendment the committee is considering in relation to clause 9, and provided its preferred wording of the amendment to clause 25. The department has provided the further information and the text of its proposed amendments, and these can be found at pages 95 to 120 of your tabled pack. A hard copy has also been provided today for members' benefit by way of the amendments, the text of the amendments, so that members can make easy reference to them. So we're going to discuss, the committee will discuss first the issues that are covered in the bill. So that's why we have Dr. Veronica Holland and Ms. Jane McGuire from the Department of Justice, and they're here for members' benefit and can come to the they don't need to come to the table. The microphones at the appropriate places where they are, so members can get some further clarity on this in respect of these amendments. Okay, so again, just to say to members, when accepting a clause or an amendment, we can express views, we can make comments. The committee, if we're not going down the route of amendments, we can then make recommendations, for example, with regard to how a clause should be implemented or the outworkings of that, and that can then be reflected in the committee report on the bill. So the first area that we're going to go to is clauses 5 and 8, which is the meaning of personal connection. The committee agreed that it was content with other aspects of the meaning of personal connection, and at the meeting on the 17th of September noted information from the department that indicated that the terms adoptive parent-child, foster parent-child and kinship care child would come within the scope of parental responsibility, but agreed to request a response to the specific questions the committee had raised regarding the term affinity. The The Department has responded, indicating that the provisions in the bill around family members relative in terms of those that are covered in it and the terminology used are similar in nature to those contained within the Family Homes and Domestic Violence Act, Northern Ireland 1998. That legislation was considered in the context of the family member relative for the bill and contains a similar reference to relationships being of the full blood, half blood or by affinity. It also contains references to step relationships. The use of the term affinity in legislation refers to the relationship that each person in a marriage has to the relations of the other person. The Departmental Solicitor Office advice wasn't sought on the matter. The Department has indicated that an individual child would legally be considered to be the child of an individual. The relationship between foster parent-child and kinship carer-child is captured in the context of parental responsibility, rather than the term affinity. This is considered appropriate given that these relationships can be short to medium term and may cover many different individuals over a period of time, while kinship relationships can be difficult to determine in terms of the basis of the relationship. More generally, the issues of parental responsibility and affinity are two separate issues. So members' views on clauses 5 and 18 of the bill in light of the additional information. Are members content? Okay. Clause 9, aggravation where the relevant child is involved. The committee raised two issues regarding Clause 9. In relation to the first, it was agreed to request further clarification of why in the bill a child is not considered a victim in their own right, to what extent the proposed amendment being considered in conjunction with the Department of Health will address this, and if there were multiple children in a home, for example 4 children, and each one was classed a victim in their own right under this legislation, would one incident result in an offence against the victim and an offence against each child under this clause, i.e. that there would be 5 separate offences. At our meeting on the 17th of September, the committee agreed that we were content with the further clarification provided by the Department in its correspondence dated the 16th of September, but we wish to see the text of the proposed amendment that is being considered in conjunction with the Department of Health. The Department has provided the text of the proposed amendment, which amends the child cruelty offence in Section 20 of the Children and Young Persons Act 1968. It is new clause 20A at Annex A of the Department's letter. The Department has outlined that this amendment will ensure that non-physical ill treatment of a child by someone with parental responsibility for them is criminalised. It will also ensure that current references to an offence around unnecessary suffering or injury to a child explicitly state that this relates to the suffering or injury being of a physical or otherwise nature, again ensuring that non-physical behaviour is captured, and this should enable matters such as isolation, humiliation, etc. to be captured, assuming acceptance of the amendment, including by the Speaker. This would make clear that it is an offence. The Department has indicated that the child cruelty offence only applies to those under the age of 16, and having liaised with colleagues in the Department of Health, as well as colleagues in the police, the Department is not aware of similar child protection provisions that can be easily adjusted to explicitly deal with non-physical ill treatment of those aged 16 and 17 in the context of a parent-child relationship. The Department would welcome the views of the Committee on reducing age threshold for the parental responsibility exclusion from under age 18 to under age 16, which is clauses 11 and 17, in order to ensure that non-physical abuse of 16 and 17-year-olds in a parent-child relationship is clearly provided for in legislation. In the absence of this, there is the possibility that it may not be possible to address non-physical ill treatment of those aged 16 and 17 in this context, and the Department has provided the text of this proposal, and it's in the Department's letter. There's a lot still to go through, Christine, here. It's all related. Okay, bear with me, members. The Department has outlined that the standard offence thresholds. The Department has outlined that the standard offence thresholds would apply insofar as any behaviour would have to be considered to be abusive, be viewed as such by a reasonable person, and occur on 2 or more occasions. The Department has also highlighted that the parental responsibility exclusion in England and Wales is also 16, which it understands has not given rise to difficulties there, and it could be considered appropriate in that it is linked to a range of age-specific permissions, for example, the school leaving age, age at which a person can live on their own, ability to work in a licensed premise, getting married or joining the armed forces with parental consent. Furthermore, any decision to charge an individual with the offence would be dependent on the particular circumstances of the case, and the reasonable person defence would also apply. And the committee was also concerned that while there is an assumption in this clause that harm has been done with the reference to seeing, hearing or being present during, that it is not specific or clear enough. Noting the wording of Clause 7, Clause 5, subsection 5 of the Scottish legislation, which states that for it to be proved that the offence is so aggravated that there does not need to be evidence that a child had ever had any awareness of or understanding of A's behaviour or been adversely affected by A's behaviour, the committee believed that to ensure effective enforcement and prosecution, the wording of Clause 9 needed to be strengthened to reflect this position more clearly. The committee was of the view that this clause required amended either by adopting Scottish wording unless there is any specific reason not to use that wording, or wording that provides the same sort of clarity, and sought confirmation from the Department regarding whether the Minister is content to bring forward an amendment on this basis. The committee also asked the Bill Clerk to prepare a draft amendment for consideration. At our meeting on the 17th of September, the committee noted the further clarification that had been provided by the Department in relation to this child aggravator offence, and the Department's view that an amendment akin to the Scottish legislation is not needed. The committee also considered the text of the draft amendment prepared by the Bill Clerk and agreed to provide the wording of the potential amendment and request the views of the Department on whether there are any implications if it was added to the clause, what value it adds to the clause, and whether the Department would consider covering this in the explanatory and financial memorandum to provide greater clarity. The Department has responded, highlighting its previous advice that the child aggravation locally is wider than the Scottish offence, in that there is no requirement for a reasonable person to consider that the behaviour would adversely impact on a child, or that the child has to live with either the victim or offender. The Scottish legislation provides that their offence is aggravated if a child sees, hears or is present, plus a reasonable person would consider the behaviour to be likely to adversely affect a child. Proving the aggravation is then subject to a condition that for the offence to be aggravated, there does not need to be evidence that the child has been aware of, understood or been adversely affected by the abuse. The offence in the Domestic Abuse and Family Proceedings Bill is aggravated on the basis of an objective fact, simply that the child sees, hears or was present. The first limb of the Scottish requirements. Turning purely on these facts, unlike the Scottish provision, which also requires a second limb of consideration of adverse effects, the clause does not raise the question of the child's awareness. The Department has expressed the view that the proposed committee amendment would therefore introduce an unrelated adverse effect provision which is unnecessary and would add nothing to the clause, and could risk giving rise to confusion by casting doubt on the effectiveness of Clause 9. The Department has indicated it will not support the amendment. It has also stated that any text in the explanatory and financial memorandum must reflect what is contained in the bill. So, members, your views on Clause 9 of the bill, including whether the committee is content to support the Department's proposed amendment to the clause and the proposed amendment to Clauses 11 and 17 to reduce the age threshold for the parental responsibility exclusion from under age 18 to under age 16 in order to ensure that non-physical abuse of 16 and 17-year-olds in a parent-child relationship is clearly provided for in legislation, and whether the potential committee amendment is required in light of the further comments from the Department. Members, apologies for that lengthy track through all of our considerations and where we're at. Linda?
I'm glad you done it, because I didn't actually have time to go through it, so it was helpful to me, and even in terms of clarifying in our own heads where we're at. They absolutely would support the reduction to the 16 and Clause 9, 11, 17. I think it was something we actually discussed previously as well as a committee, and so I'd imagine it's not something we have a great challenge with, I think. And I suppose I'd want to hear from Rachel around this, because it obviously was herself who suggested the amendment, and I wasn't opposed to it. But I think given the explanation that the department have given, and even the conversation that we had at our previous committee meeting last week on the 17th, where I felt we were actually getting confused around the amendment, and it concerned me that we were going down that road. And explanations that we had also give me confidence that actually what was already there is maybe better than any amendment we would put forward. So I'm content that we don't amend it, but I would like to hear from Rachel, obviously, because it was her proposal, and I don't want, I suppose, just to throw it out the window without hearing from the person who proposed it. But just to put on record that I would be supportive of both reducing to 16 and keeping clause 9 as it is.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Rachel, do you want to pick up on it?
Aye.
Don't tell me.
The first point, just in terms of the age reduction, this for me changes the scope of the bill quite drastically. I'm wondering if there has been any conversations with stakeholders on this, Nikki and the NSPCC, and does this sort of now say that domestic abuse offence can be prosecuted against parents of 16 and 17-year-olds? That would be certainly my first
Veronica,
question.
Let's invite you in just to deal with that straight away.
In terms of the change that's being suggested there, it is only in the context of the child-parental responsibility relationship. It isn't making any change in terms of the bill more generally, so it's in relation to that specific element of it. But yes, as you say, the domestic abuse offence would then apply to parental-child relationships for 16, 17-year-olds. I suppose the flip side of that is, in the absence of the reduction in the parental responsibility exclusion from underage 18 to underage 16, our concern is that potentially non-physical ill treatment of a child, that is non-physical abusive behaviour, may not be sufficiently captured within other offences. So that's the rationale why we're suggesting that parental responsibility exclusion threshold is reduced down, but it doesn't affect kind of the provisions of the bill in relation to 16 and 17-year-olds in other relationships.
Okay, so it's just because it's obviously this is quite a different bit of a change in terms of parental responsibility and who that applies to. So we are saying now that parents could be sort of done, for a better word, under this offence if there was under the domestic abuse offence for a 16-year-old but not a 15-year-old. So recognising that abuse can be done to 16 and 17-year-olds but not a 15-year-old.
I suppose the rationale for that is that in our previous consideration of legislation, we had felt that this was adequately captured within child protection legislation. So effectively that behaviour would be criminalised, albeit in a different guise. Having discussed this further with colleagues in both police, PPS and health, it's now, we have a clearer understanding that there are limitations there. So as I say, that's why that change is being brought forward. But I suppose our appreciation previously had been that this was captured under child protection legislation previously. So if an individual as a parent was abusing a child non-physically, that would have been captured under other provisions. We now appreciate that it potentially doesn't. So I suppose it's shifting in terms of the criminalisation of it, the type of legislation that's governing it, if that makes sense.
Okay, and just lastly on that, has there been any discussion with stakeholders, NSPCC, Nikki, any of the child protection organisation or children rights organisation on this?
We haven't had discussions with them to date. That was because we wanted to come and take the committee's views on this in the first instance. Because obviously if the committee wasn't minded to follow that, we didn't want to have had those discussions with stakeholders, but certainly that's something that we would do subsequent to this, if the committee were agreeable.
I'm content to progress that forward, but I would very much welcome input from those organisations that had raised this.
My problem with this change is that I've had no time to consider it, and we haven't had any feedback, and to make that kind of a change in the absence of a consultative process that the committee engaged in to get feedback, a change of that nature, I don't feel is something that I would be able to support in the absence of having went through that process. The spirit behind it and what we're talking about, I certainly have sympathy for, but I would be wary about putting my hand up for something that I haven't been able to exhaustively test, just so that I know what the consequences of it would be. Rachel?
Chair, just to come back on that, that's sort of what I'm saying in terms of content to progress that forward, to look at what this actually means for the bill. I'm mindful when the previous Attorney General was here, there was a discussion about parental responsibility in terms of protecting the child from nefarious activities. So with the parental responsibility exclusion, would you have, a 17-year-old who has got cash restrictions because of parental responsibilities now being able to take parents to court within this legislation? It's just trying to make sure that that isn't covered, or what the consequences of this is before, I believe, just because we got it last night, just to be able to make any decisions on it.
Okay. Paul?
Just like yourselves, Chair, I think I will remain mute on the age change, because we have not had time to consider it. That's no fault of the department either, because obviously they're thinking about these things through too. So I just think we need to be guarded in how we proceed with giving the department the advice on that, because we need to look at it more thoroughly. On the more specific issue around the child's awareness with regards to Clause 9 and the aggravation where a relevant child is involved, I think the confusion for me anyway last week was where we actually placed this amendment. I'm still of mind that we need this amendment, and I would like, I think, the department to explain to me how it could lead to confusion and how it could do damage and to the effectiveness of Clause 9 by adding it. Because what I simply say, what I mean by that is, where do we place it? We talked a lot last week about Clause 9 2A2, the made use of the child in directing behaviour be. And when you look at the explanatory notes, what that basically explicitly means is that this could apply where the accused encourages or directs the child to spy on or report on the day-to-day activities of a partner. The involvement of the child could be unwittingly or unwillingly. So I get where that covers that piece. The child's been asked to, or told or forced to act something out. But where I think we need this amendment is actually in Clause 9 2A1, the directed behaviour at the child. And when you look at the explanatory notes, that states that that section provides that the aggravation applies where it is shown that at any time in commissioning the offence the accused directed behaviour at a child. And it goes in then to explain this could include the accused threatening violence towards a child to control or frighten the partner-connected person or being abusive towards the child. That's, to me, the essence of coercive control, whereby a perpetrator would only have to threaten to abuse or to hurt or to make witness the child to an offence against the victim, to have a massive impact and effect on the victim, and to coerce that victim. And that's why I think we need something, either by way of an amendment or by it being explained in the explanatory note, that the child doesn't necessarily have to be aware of the perpetrator's behaviour, or even to understand the nature of the perpetrator's behaviour, or even be adversely affected by the perpetrator's behaviour, because they could be downstairs, upstairs, watching TV, sleeping, when that threat is implied to the victim. And that threat would probably only have to be made the once, but it could be repeated time and time again, and the child would have no consciousness of that threat being implied. And that's where I think we need it in writing. I'm not sure whether we need it and I would be worried that we would do damage to the bill. So that's why I'm leaving it open for the department to tell me, yeah, well, there might be some room here with regards to the explanatory note. But, you know, in the explanatory note, you do define or explain what effect a clause would have. So I just don't understand why we can't have an amendment like this that explicitly states that the child doesn't actually need to be aware or understand. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Veronica?
I suppose again that's coming back to the references to the child seeing, hearing or being present. So as we've noted in the letter, it's in relation to those facts that consideration is being given to. If there wasn't an amendment in the bill, it probably wouldn't be appropriate to make reference to it in the explanatory and financial memorandum, but it is perhaps something that we could look at in the context of the guidance that's associated with the domestic abuse offence, and that's going to be done under Clause 25 more generally. But I suppose in terms of the position more generally, for both Clause 8 and Clause 9, it's very much the aggravation is on that factual basis of see, hear or is present. So as long as the child sees, hears or is present, that aggravation could apply, and there, you know, it's turning on that fact as opposed to any provision in relation to the awareness more generally. Certainly it's something that we could look at in the guidance if that provides any reassurance.
So just on that, and thank you very much, Veronica, for this. I really appreciate this engagement. But to me, 9.2b actually weakens what I'm trying to state with regards to the nature of coercive control, because then it is basically saying a child has to see or hear or be present during an instant of behaviour. When we know coercive control and the nature of it isn't necessarily like that. So that's why I think we need something stronger, and I think this amendment adds to that. Because we know that the perpetrator will be very sleeked, very secretive even, to the point where he may well do things whereby those three requirements, the child saw or heard or was present, might not be captured.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of those elements and the awareness provision, to us that awareness provision is almost, it's supplementary to that initial requirement and how the aggravation would apply. Fully appreciate where you're coming from in relation to that, but I think it is coming back to the, you know, none of those conditions require the child to have been aware of what the behaviour may be. You know, for example, it could be a very, very young child that has been present at the time, and the aggravation could still apply in that context, although fully appreciate in terms of controlling and coercive behaviour more generally, you know, the extent to which that can apply in relation to children.
Linda?
Just on Paul's point, I thought we had kind of settled last week that the explanatory note, if the explanatory note was changed, and I know that probably was the Chair's view, because we were all getting confused around the amendment, and if it was confusing us, then I think it would confuse anybody else, to be fair, because we're looking at this stuff day and daily. So that was my reason. I thought that the explanatory note could have been changed, and the points that Paul are making are exactly my concerns. And if the explanatory note cannot be changed, then in that instance we may well have to go back to looking at an amendment, because I wouldn't be content that it's only in the guidance, to be honest with you, just because of the importance of this. And I think it's getting back to, and I've used the example in previous meetings, I'm just going to use the same one again for ease, but in terms of the heart case, I mean, on one occasion the father brought peanuts into the home because one of the children had a nut allergy. Now, the child didn't have to be in the room or even in the house, but the implication was, I will harm the children by causing a potentially life-threatening injury to one of them. There was nothing said in terms of that. The child, as I say, may not have been in the house whenever they were brought into the home, but the child was actually being used in that circumstance in terms of coercive control. So that's the kind of circumstance that Paul's talking about, and I'm sure we could I could quote millions of examples. I'm just quoting that one because it's on record and it's a case that people are...
If it's helpful, we can certainly look at the text that's in the explanatory memorandum at the moment and see what further clarification we can provide in relation to that to try and deal with this issue, if that would be helpful.
I think it would be good if it's done in the explanatory note, but if it can't be, I would be concerned then that
I suppose typically, I suppose where I was coming from in terms of not being able to deal with it in the explanatory note is that if you don't have a clause there, your explanatory note wouldn't refer to it, if that makes sense. But certainly we could look and see how, in the context of 9.2 in relation to the sees, hears or is present, what further clarification we can provide in relation to that bit of the clause in terms of this issue more generally to try and deal with the concerns that are being raised, if that makes sense.
No, I actually think the explanatory note would be around 9.2A2 in relation to the kind of the issues that Paul and I are talking about, because it's making use of the child. That means that the child may know nothing about it, and it's not just making use of them in the terms in which that are already there around the spying or the giving information on a parent or anything like that. Making use of a child is the implied threat of the harm I will do to a child if you don't behave in a certain way or if you don't go along with. But I mean, Paul can speak for himself.
So that's where I think I got confused last week, because 2A2 is a made use of the child, and the explanatory note actually talks about the child being used, whereas in 2A1 it's a directed behaviour at the child, which is different. So that's, to me, the threat to harm the child, the directed behaviour at the child. So I think it actually sits better in 2A1. But again, then it's the 2B that basically says the child saw or heard. I think it's the 2B that actually does the damage for me. It actually doesn't give me any reassurance whatsoever. And that's where, even in the explanatory notes, whether it's to clarify 2B, that would be helpful, but it would also, I think, could be added at 2A1, where it states that this could include an accused threatening violence towards a child to control or frighten a partner, a connected person, or being abusive towards the child. And then at the end of that, you could add, even if the child has not been aware or understanding of the nature of A's behaviour. So, to me, it can fall in either of those two places, just to clarify the whole of Clause 9. But I do think it's required. I suppose the question I still pose to the Department is, how do they see that this would do damage in either creating confusion or casting doubt on the effectiveness of 9? How would that actually work?
I suppose we feel by you're bringing in a provision into the bill which, because it's, because of the nature and the way in which it's constructed, we don't have a provision akin to the Scottish one where you have a reasonable person would consider that the child is aware of, and their element, that amendment that is being put forward in the Scottish bill, is on foot of that earlier element in their bill, if you know what I mean. So they have a bit prior to the awareness amendment that we're talking about, the two being connected. We don't have that element in our bill, so therefore it's considered that additional bit is unnecessary. Certainly we can have further discussions with Council in terms of, is there something further that we could cover in the explanatory note which might provide further clarification in relation to this, if that's helpful.
I still think, and I'll lay it on the line here, I still think that the explanatory note is a second best option, and I would rather see something on the face of the bill. But if you can convince me that the explanatory note is the place for it to be, then so be it. But I'm still of the mind that we really want to try and amend the legislation itself. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Sinead Bradley, and then Rachel.
Thank you, Chair. Just on those 2 points, yes, we have gone round on this, I think, in terms of whether it should be in the face of the bill, whether that filters it, and then the explanatory note. And I did believe we were actually looking at a change in the explanatory note, which I don't really see. So there's clearly still a piece of work there to be done. In terms of the age reduction, my understanding of this, and I stand to be corrected on it, that the reduction in age basically is the meeting point where other legislation, if we say, oh, well, this bill wouldn't service children of that age, but by a reduction in the age, we actually create a further net to safeguard that 17 and 18-year-old that doesn't exist. But I do think the wise way to go forward in this is, as has been suggested, is to have conversations with Nikki and all those stakeholders who would specifically look at that age profile, because my thinking of it is not clear enough to be able to give an assertion at this time. Thank you, Chair.
Rachel. Thanks, Chair. I know, appreciate we have had long conversations about this, and apologies, but okay. I'm going to put in a bit of a curveball here. What if we remove the child needing to see, hear, or is present during an incident and replace it with a reasonable person test? Because that could refer, just to try and tease that out, if there is a victim, say, with a dependent child suffering from economic abuse or financial abuse, which is obviously in this bill, leading to a financial strain and an inability to provide for the child, for example. Furthermore, then psychological abuse or coercive control, that's obviously in this bill, where the child has never witnessed behaviour such as the financial abuse or the coercive control, but the effects on the victim have had a knock-on effects to the child. A reasonable person would assume that adverse effects have been had on the child. There's no requirement for the child to see, hear, or be present, but a reasonable person could say that domestic abuse has occurred against B by A and it be aggravated under 9. So, apologies, that's another way. No. Rather than adding something in, as it is in Scotland, and I appreciate that there are some additional hoops to jump through in the Scottish Act when he sees, hear, or is present during an incident, plus the reasonable person would consider the abuse. But if we remove the sees, hear, is present and just talked about the reasonable person test, which is not in ours, could that cover all of the issues that we're batting back and forth here?
Just on that's a very natural progression of thought process in this, because I've always said, even last week, I have a problem with 9.2b, because basically I think, so if you read 9.1, it basically says that the offence is aggravated by reason of involving a relevant child. And then we go down to 9.2b, and that actually clarifies what they actually, and restricts that the child saw or heard or was present during. To me, that's the damaging bit here. To me, that's the bit I have the problem with, which then sought me out an amendment to try and fix that or strengthen that. So that process, that's not a curveball, that's just a natural progression of thought progress, to be honest with you. And I'm probably there with Rachel. If we can't insert the what I call the awareness and understanding test on the child, if we can't insert that into the bill, then I think the next logical step is to remove the bit that I have a problem with, which is the child saw or heard or was present.
I'll get Veronica's view in that in a moment. I want to understand, Paul, your position and Rachel's as to why this needs to be in. Give me the scenario that requires this, because I'm not convinced. I'll be honest. My position is I entirely agree with the department on this. So, explain to me why this needs to be in.
So we'll use Linda's scenario, and that scenario paints the picture that the child doesn't need to see or hear or be present. I also use Rachel's example with regards to the financial aspect. That child does not need to see or hear or be present. And then I use my example whereby the perpetrator threatens to rape, and this is very harsh. The perpetrator threatens to rape the victim in front of a child, which we've heard of before. That's horrendous. But the child doesn't need to see, hear, or be present when that threat is implied. And that threat will last a lifetime. And I don't see that we've sufficiently covered that threat, or any of the scenarios that we've painted, with when you have a clause like 9.2b. So to me, it's the damage that 9.2b does that could all of those three scenarios that I've painted, that could that could hurt that case with having 9(2)(b) in.
Veronica.
I suppose our concern in relation to the removal of 9(2)(b) would be you're removing a provision that the only condition is essentially that the child is somewhere, the child sees it, the child hears it, or the child is present for it. So it could be something that's very, very indirect, it isn't obvious, but is very, very controlling, very, very coercive behaviour and has a severe impact in relation to the partner or family member in question. So I think the removal of that provision would significantly detrimentally impact in terms of those types of situations where the child may not necessarily be aware of what's going on. I suppose the other concern would be in relation to the removal of that and a substitution with the awareness provision would be coming back to that condition being a reasonable person would consider that that would adversely impact on the child. Obviously, if you have very explicit or obvious physical behaviour or non-physical behaviour, you know, it could be made out that that would adversely impact on the child. I think there is, though, because of the nature of controlling and coercive behaviour, emotional abuse, financial abuse, etc., whether or not you would be able to sufficiently argue that it could be considered, and I suppose it's coming back to that wording, that it would actually adversely impact on the child. A lot of the behaviours that may not necessarily be obvious.
Yeah, but Chair, remember clause 9 is all about the aggravation of the crime. It's not about the child. It's not about the crime to the child. Mm-hmm. It's about the aggravation.
But for the aggravation to apply, the reasonable person would have to consider that it would adversely impact on that child.
No, I disagree completely on that, because it's how it would affect the victim, not the child. And I think that's where the aggravation should be, is how it impacts on the victim, which is always named as B. And that's why, if you read 9(1), it may be specified as an allegation alongside a charge of the domestic abuse offence against the person A that the offence is aggravated by reason of involving a relevant child. Full stop. Leave it there. And then you go on, for the purposes of subsection 1, the domestic abuse offence is aggravated by reason of involving a relevant child if, at any time in the commission of the offence, a directed behaviour at the child or the made use of the child in directing behaviour at B. End of. Leave it there. I don't know why we have to add in that the child saw or heard or was present. And so that's why I really have a problem with 9(2)(b), and because of that, we've sought to clarify that with an amendment which gives an awareness and understanding test to the child, that they don't need to have awareness or understanding. And I just think, whilst we include 9(2)(b) in this, I think we need the awareness and understanding of the child to be addressed. So that's where I'm at, because it's all about the aggravation in clause 9, not the actual crime against the child.
Veronica, do you want to come back on that?
I suppose in terms of the two scenarios that are being put forward, in terms of remove 9(2)(b), as I say, we would have significant concerns with the removal of 9(2)(b), given the types of scenarios that it covers. But you know, there is the separate issue of whether or not we agree with the amendment that was proposed by the committee. As we've set out, we don't consider that's necessary, but I would be of the view to remove 9(2)(b) and replace with the amendment, as opposed to have 9(2)(b) and have the amendment. The removal of 9(2)(b) I consider would have significant implications in terms of the types of cases that could be brought forward where it would be aggravated by virtue of, and again coming back to the fact that aggravation is simply the fact that the child has been there. There doesn't have to be any impact on the child doesn't have to be aware of it. It is simply turning on the fact the child saw, heard or was present in those scenarios where the child has been basically present for that abuse. As I say, we would have significant concerns about B being removed.
Makes, just so I can clear this up, he's saying that it should only be about the victim. The offence and the charge taken is the offence against the victim.
The aggravation is in relation to the child.
Child's involved, so
yeah.
There is already the very fact of what we're proposing here in this legislation is we're creating a new offence as to what has been done to the victim. If you want if you're going to add additional penalty or so on because it relates solely to the victim, then increase the penalty. But the aggravation here is the different factors, and that's the child. I'm just trying to get my head when you said, Paul, it's about the victim.
Yeah, 9 is simply the aggravation in relation.
It's an additional factor to take into account.
Because I suppose almost in a sense, it's not that they're separate, but effectively you have your domestic abuse offence in and of its own right, and you have the aggravation. And the aggravation, the focus on that is how can we increase the sentencing effectively in relation to the underpinning domestic abuse offence, because there has been the involvement in a child in a range of guises. Yeah. So yes, the focus of the aggravator is the linkage with the child.
Yeah. And the child here doesn't need to be aware of it, it just needs to be there, and I suppose that was really why we didn't incorporate that element of, we did consider at the outset the Scottish provisions and the changes that were made, but we were keen to have an aggravator which was effectively, because there is a child there present, in that kind of situation, that in and of itself is sufficient in our mind for consideration to be given by the court to increase the sentencing that may otherwise have been attributable for that offence. We are of the view that the Scottish provisions are more limiting than ours, in that you have to bring in the reasonable person aspect. Yeah. And the awareness.
Yeah.
Linda?
The more we talk, the more I'm going back to the explanatory note, but I'm going to completely confuse the issue now, and go back to the first point around, just quickly, around the 16, 17-year-old. The point that you're making around, that the child could take their parent for financial abuse, I don't think is right, because this is, in clause 9, it's only around an aggravating factor, so it's not actually, that doesn't, it potentially is different in the other clauses, but not in that one. So I think that we probably would have less concerns about that, given that that's the fact. And I actually think it needs to be in there for that reason, because the 16, 17-year-olds should not be, they should not be considered an adult if they're still living in the home and could still potentially be used against their parent in whatever form, whether it's.
And I suppose, by way of clarification, in terms of the parental responsibility exclusion and the change in that age, we're not suggesting that there's any change in relation to the aggravating factors for that very reason, and the fact that, by and large, we consider children to be under the age of 18.
Yeah. So I think that on that point we should have less concerns, but I just wanted to throw that out there for the other members who had concerns around it. I keep coming back to changing the explanatory note, and I'm not actually, I'm not precious about whether it's changed in 9A1 or 9A2, 9.2A1 or 9.2A2. This gets very confusing. But I would really like that somewhere there in the explanatory note that it states that the implication, that the use of a child around implied hurt or injury, and whatever wording in it, I don't know what the wording would be around that, and Stephanie would be probably the better person to come in on that, and that's actually what I was going to say, Chair. Could Stephanie come in and give us an idea if the explanatory could be changed there? Is that possible, and is that something that could work in your view? And I know that's obviously the department has a view, but
we can bring Stephanie in, but Stephanie's contribution's always done in closed session.
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Oh, sorry.
You're okay.
You want us to step out?
No, because we're let's deal with. Let's deal with this. You've given the reason that the explanatory financial memorandum always follows what's in the legislation. So I take that point. You can't put something into an EFM which isn't in legislation. Committee needs to decide, does it want to change the legislation, and then it'll naturally flow. It goes into the EFM. I don't think it's, for me, the solution here, not the solution, because I think some members have a view of what needs to be in it and others are differing, but the only area where the awareness issue comes into play, if we don't change the amendment, is in the guidance. I don't personally feel that an EFM can flow and accommodate members' views if we don't actually introduce an amendment to legislation. So if there's going to be this addressed outside of legislation, I suspect at best it's going to be the guidance will make it clear when it comes to the awareness issue, what the committee is trying to convey.
Could you add the reasonable person and not remove? Would that be a potential wrong?
Although I suppose that's coming back to what the original suggestion was, and again our view that we don't think that provision is needed because we don't have the two limbs that Scotland have. There would obviously be nothing to stop either the committee or a member, but from a departmental perspective, that would be our view.
Okay, members.
Chair, the least I would be expecting is a change in the explanatory notes. I will not take the department on face value with regards to what's included in the guidance. If we're going to go down that road, we can always put an amendment into the bill to say that the guidance should include something, and we don't want to go there.
You might, but it's.
I'm not, I suppose, necessarily directing at the department that they wouldn't put it in, because I'll be less cynical and say I think that, in fairness, if the committee directed that we really thought it was important, you might. It's just that guidance is only guidance, and that's where I become concerned. It's how it then plays out at the other end.
Yep.
You know, that can.
Chair, just to confirm it, I wasn't suggesting that remove 9.2b complete, and not replace it with anything. It was, if 9.2b is the sticking point, could that be replaced with the reasonable person test to cover all of these aspects that we're talking about? But it wasn't a direct removal without something else going in.
I take the point about the reasonable person test, that the Scottish model is a poorer version of what this bill is trying to do. So I accept the argument that the department is putting forward. That's my personal view on it, and therefore, why would it be necessary? But listen, members are going to have to come to a view on it now, because we've debated this at length week after week, and at some point you've got to decide what are you going to do on it, and whose opinion are you going to take as the one that you feel that you should flow with. I take the view that this is an aggravating factor where a child has been involved, and based on it being an aggravating factor where a child is involved, that this bill as drafted doesn't require awareness to be an issue, and to put in an amendment to say that just creates unnecessary legislation.
Can I add to that? It actually does mention in explanatory notes in one place that the child doesn't need to be, could be unwittingly or unwillingly, and that's the explanatory note on subsection 2A2. So if it's good enough for it to be there, and it's not going to do violence to the bill, why would it do violence to the bill or clause 9 somewhere else by including it somewhere else? And the very fact that you've included it in section 2A2 but not in 2A1 is enough to worry me. So even if that line...
If it helps the committee, we can certainly speak to Legislative Council in terms of, if Paul, if you're saying, and an apology, I can't recall, even though we have written it, if there's reference to that in 9.2A2, we can certainly ask the question of Council in terms of, could a similar sentence be included in relation to 9.2B, if that is helpful.
Yeah, that to me would be.
I don't think that it's not in the legislation. I just think that somebody's looked at it and decided what made use of or what directed at means, and so look at it again, given all the examples that have been given here, would be my view, and change the explanation.
Certainly, as we say, 9.2b is simply the sees here or is present, and by virtue of that, the child doesn't need to be aware. So if, that sentence could probably, and we look at the sentence that is in 9.2a2, that sentence could potentially be replicated in 9.2b as well. But as I say, we'll have discussions with Legislative Council in relation to that.
9.2A1.
A1.
It's where I think, so it's at the minute it's in 9.2A2, but it's not in 9.2A1, and I just don't understand why it wouldn't be in 9.2A1 whenever the directed behaviour at the child is where it needs to be unwittingly and unaware of. So it's nearly as if
so you're saying there's a reference in relation to 9.2A2?
Yeah. Yes.
But you essentially think it should be covering 9.2A generally?
Yes. So that last
we will certainly have that conversation with Council.
Yeah, the last sentence on that paragraph, subsection 2A2, it states the involvement of the child could be unwittingly or unwillingly. And it ends there, full stop.
Now, if Paul has provided a solution, I'll give a hearty amen to that.
I can support it.
Certainly we will look at that and do what we can do.
Okay. We're doing the formal clause by clause next week, so no pressure. Okay, then the other aspect is this around the Section 20 of the Children and Young Person Act 1998, to do with that proposed amendment that's been worked up with Health. Reference in it, the Department's letter is where you'll find the proposed text. Christine, do you just want to remind us on this issue again for members' benefit?
Yes, the wording has been provided at, it's in the departmental letter dated the 23rd of September, and it provides the wording of a proposed new clause that amends the Children and Young Persons Act, Northern Ireland 1968. So it's really whether the committee is content or has any further questions on that proposed amendment. The department's highlighting that it will ensure that non-physical ill treatment of a child by someone with parental responsibility for them is criminalised. It will also ensure that current references to an offence around unnecessary suffering or injury to a child explicitly state that this relates to the suffering or injury being of a physical or otherwise nature, again ensuring that non-physical behaviour is captured, and this should enable matters such as isolation, humiliation, etc. to be captured. And assuming acceptance of the amendment, including by the Speaker, this would make clear that it is an offence. However, then the Department has also highlighted the issue that was covered earlier about that this amendment would only only applies to those under the age of 16, and then the Department has put forward a proposal regarding changing the age to ensure that non-physical abuse of 16 and 17-year-olds in a parent-child relationship is clearly provided for in legislation. Put forward those amendments to clauses 11 and 17. So it's whether the committee has any views on that specific clause that it would apply to child cruelty offence for those under the age of 16, or whether, and I think from views expressed you need more time to consider the other issue. So it's whether you have anything further you want to ask the departmental officials on these proposals, or whether you just need more time to consider.
Is the issue here that the issue around the child cruelty is needed, but it creates this consequence that you're flagging up as the concern?
Yeah. Essentially, you wouldn't have this issue if the child cruelty offence applied to those under the age of 18, but essentially because it's only applying to under 16s, it's leaving less protection for 16 and 17-year-olds. And while we fully appreciate the concerns in terms of the reduction of the parental responsibility exclusion and the potential in relation to parental responsibility, as I say, the flip side of that is if we don't reduce the parental responsibility exclusion threshold, there are lesser protections available in relation to 16 and 17-year-olds, albeit that, as I say, we fully appreciate the concerns in terms of that coming under the auspices of the domestic abuse offence as opposed to child protection legislation.
Notwithstanding the dilemma it creates in that respect, you'd still want to go with this amendment, and then we would need to decide if you wanted to address the non-physical abuse for 16 and 17-year-olds.
And I suppose the difficulty in that context is because of the scope of the bill, you're straying into child protection provisions. While we're doing this amendment, there's a linkage in with the child aggravator, with the child aspect. We wouldn't be able to do something material from a child protection perspective through this bill. So I suppose that's why, part of the reason why we're looking at this as well is to try and ensure as much coverage as possible.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, I think we also need to see
Linda.
what's... Sorry, Linda, go on ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean...
I was just looking at a point of clarity. So really what you're saying, Veronica, is if we don't change it from 18 to 16 in this bill, we can't put something else in because of the scope of the bill to protect that age group?
Yeah, that would be my view. Obviously, it would be a matter for the Speaker, but given that we're dealing with domestic abuse offence and family proceedings, this is strength. It is definitively, you know, it's in health territory. It's not justice territory.
Yeah, Paul.
Just the only point, and again, I'm still mute on the age thing because I just haven't enough time to consider it. But we also, I think, need to see exactly what's been repealed from the '68 Act. We've got the wording of the new clause, which states that the wordings from including, I think the word including to derangement are repealed, but we don't actually know all the wording in between.
I should have brought that provision with me, but from memory, it's dealing with examples of non-physical ill treatment. So there are 3 or 4 references, as I say, to mental derangement and a number of other terms. And it's therefore considered, because we're basically saying physical or otherwise, we're doing physical plus anything that's non-physical. Essentially, the terminology that was referenced there by way of examples is no longer needed. You could still include it, but it's not necessary to have it there.
Okay, so if I can separate this in 2 parts, are members content with the amendment that has been put forward that deals with the cruelty aspect, in terms of the wording of that and what it's trying to achieve? Okay, then the issue we need to look at is whether or not we want to pursue the non-physical for 16, 17-year-olds.
Chair, I was mute there because I'm not satisfied because we just haven't enough time to look at it.
Yeah.
Too late.
You know, that's...
If it's helpful, we can share the extract from the letter to the committee in relation to that with Nikki and NSPCC and ask them if they can come back with some views in relation to that ahead of the committee meeting next week.
Okay. Members, I'm just keen to tease this one out because there's a kind of procedural issue for me, irrespective of getting that response back next week, because of the change it's talked about, that we didn't go out and seek views on it and so on. I appreciate when you come to amendments, we're not doing that either, but yeah. It's a difficult issue I think I'm going to have with what's being talked about. We're doing the formal clause by clause next week, Christine.
We are.
So is there amendments on trying to achieve this for the 16 and 17-year-olds?
Yeah.
The amendment is simply replacing 18 with 16. It's a simple amendment.
Okay.
There's nothing more to it than that.
Okay.
If the committee doesn't feel it has had the time to look at the amendment, it can simply note it. It doesn't have to reach a decision on it.
Yeah. Okay, members. Well, so that we just know for next week what it is that we're doing on this aspect. The amendment will be there, but members should decide in advance of that, in the absence of the feedback. If we get it, we get it. But it's difficult for a committee report to have deliberated the way it should have, in my opinion, for it to be a committee considered position. Maybe it's a department amendment that they bring in and they explain it in the floor of the House, and procedurally then that's a more appropriate way, in my view, that you then vote for it. Okay. Christine, is there any other element in this section that needs to be clarified?
No, we await the department coming back with possible amendment wording for next week in relation to
Clause 9 and the unwittingly comment.
So as I said, we'll have discussions with Council in relation to that, and we'll also see if we can get views from NSPCC and Nikki with a view to having that with the committee for their session next week.
Okay, but And members are content then with the proposed amendment that's been worked up with Health on cruelty.
Just before they go, because this is very important, because we don't want to waste anybody's time, but that sentence, when you read it, the involvement of a child could be unwittingly or unwillingly. Now, does that refer to the child, or does that refer to either perpetrator or victim? That's something we need clarified too, just in the wording as it sits.
Without having the wording in front of me, Paul, it would be the child.
Right, okay.
Would be my recollection.
Where are we?
You know, so basically the child knows, while the child is involved in the abusive behaviour, the child effectively knows nothing about it.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Clause 13 then, the alternative available for conviction. The committee had requested further information and detail from the department on why clause 13 is necessary, how it would work in practice, including the provision of a scenario or example illustrating this, and what the implications would be if it was removed from the bill. The committee was also concerned that the wording of the clause does not clearly reflect the explanation of the purpose of the clause provided by departmental officials, and asked the department to reflect on how the wording of the clause could be changed or enhanced to better reflect its purpose. At our meeting on the 17th of September, committee considered the further information provided by the department and noted that it would amend the explanatory and financial memorandum to include the scenario as an example, and will also include this in the guidance which is being produced on the new offence. The committee agreed that in light of the further information and action to be taken by the department, it is content with clause 13 as drafted. The committee also agreed to request further information on the burden of proof evidential test required to meet the test of personal connection. The department has outlined further information on this in its letter dated the 23rd of September, which members have. So, members, that information is there for you to note, unless there's any other points members are wanting to make in respect of clause 13. No.
Just that that's clarified a good lot of the stuff that I was concerned about. So.
Sorry, Paul?
That's clarified a lot of the stuff that I had been concerned about.
Okay, thank you. Clause 22, around special measures. At our meeting on the 10th of September, the committee agreed to request confirmation that it is the department's intention to adopt the recommendation of Women's Aid and the recommendation in the Gillen Review regarding a guarantee of special measures in the family court. At the meeting on the 17th of September, the committee noted the additional information provided by the department and agreed to consider this clause further when the wording of the department's proposed amendment to require court rules to make specific provision in relation to special measures in family and civil proceedings for victims of domestic abuse and other offences was available. The department has provided the text of the draft amendments. Their new clauses 26A and 26C at Annex A of the department's letter. The department had previously indicated that the court rules will make provision so that victims of domestic abuse are automatically eligible for consideration of special measures in family and civil proceedings. It will be for the court hearing the proceedings to determine whether it is necessary to make a direction for special measures in an individual case. The department also outlined in its correspondence dated 9th of September its intention, with the agreement of the Department of Finance, to amend Article 12A of the Children in Northern Ireland Order 1995 so that a court considering an application for a contact or residency order will be specifically required to have regard to the conviction of the party applying for the order for the new domestic abuse offence where the child aggravator has been applied. The department has provided the text of this proposed amendment, and it is found in pages 126 to 128. So, members, your views on clause 22 of the bill, and whether the committee is now content to support the department's proposed amendments that require court rules to make specific provision in relation to special measures in family and civil proceedings for victims of domestic abuse and other offences, and or the proposed amendment to Article 12A of the Children Northern Ireland Order 1995. Members content? Content. Clause 25, guidance on domestic abuse. At our meeting on the 10th of September, the committee agreed that it wants 25(1) changed from may to either will or must in relation to provision of guidance by the department. It agreed to ask the department for confirmation regarding whether the minister was content to bring forward such an amendment. The committee also asked the bill clerk to prepare a draft amendment. At our meeting on the 17th of September, the committee noted the minister had agreed to table an amendment to change the word may to must in clause 25 and the Department was instructing Council to draft the amendment. The Committee also considered that draft amendments prepared by the Bill Clerk and agreed to provide its preferred wording for amendment to the Department. The Department has provided alternative wording that would amend both subsection 1 and subsection 3. The proposed amendment provides that the Department must issue guidance on Part 1 of the Bill and such other matters as it considers appropriate. Keep the guidance under review and revise it if it considers revision necessary in light of the review. This ensures that the change requested for by the Committee is dealt with in both parts of the clause as appropriate. The Department has also highlighted that given the duty imposed, the Interpretation Act of Northern Ireland 1954 automatically requires the guidance to be revised from time to time as the occasion requires. In the absence of this, the text of the amendment can be found in the Department's letter. So if members are content to support the Department proposed amendment to clause 25. Content.
Yeah.
Clause 26, prohibition of cross-examination in person. At our meeting on the 10th September, the Committee agreed to request confirmation that it is the Department's intention to adopt the recommendation of Women's Aid in relation to an automatic prohibition of cross-examination in any family proceedings where there are allegations of domestic abuse, or whether the perpetrator has admitted to domestic abuse and the recommendations in the Gillen Review relevant to court proceedings in domestic abuse cases. At the meeting on the 17th of September, the Committee noted the additional information that had been provided by the Department, which confirmed that in relation to the recommendation of Women's Aid, provision has already been made in the Bill for an automatic prohibition to apply where there is other specified evidence of domestic abuse. The other types of evidence of domestic abuse will be specified in regulations that the Department will consult on. In cases where an automatic prohibition does not apply, a court will have a discretionary power to prohibit cross-examination in person. The Committee agreed to consider this clause further when the wording of the proposed amendment to require court rules to provide for a court hearing, civil proceedings to have a discretionary power to prohibit cross-examination in person, together with a proposed minor amendment to require a court considering whether to exercise its discretionary power to prohibit cross-examination in person to have regard to findings of fact made in civil or criminal proceedings as well as family proceedings. The Department has provided the text of the draft amendment. It is new clause 26B at Annex A of the Department's letter. And the Department has also drawn the attention of the Committee to a small error in relation to clause 26 that occurred while the bill was being processed prior to its introduction, and has provided the text of an amendment to correct this. This draft amendment is at Annex A of the Department's letter. So members, your views on clause 26 of the bill, if you are content to support the Department's proposed amendment that require court rules to provide for a court hearing, civil proceedings to have the discretionary power to prohibit cross-examination in person, and to require a court considering whether to exercise its discretionary power to prohibit cross-examination in person to have regard to findings of fact made in civil or criminal proceedings as well as family proceedings, and or the amendment to correct the processing error that has occurred. Members are content. The Department has advised of 3 other minor and somewhat technical drafting amendments to Clause 8, Clause 10 and Clause 13 that the Department intends to bring forward. They do not make any policy change. The amendments to Clauses 8 and 10 tidy a small aspect of the wording in each place, particularly to reflect the position that the course of behaviour under the main offence is not the sole element of the domestic abuse offence. The amendment to Clause 13, which deals with an alternative offence as to the domestic abuse offence, would insert provision for the avoidance of doubt as to reflect the Criminal Law Act 1967, which contains general provisions for alternative verdicts in indictment proceedings. This is to make sure that there is no risk of implying that the provisions in the 67 Act are ousted by what is contained in Clause 13. The Department has provided the text of the proposed amendments, which are found in the Department's letter. So members are asked to note the 3 proposed minor technical amendments unless there is further information required from members. Noted. The formal questions on them will be put during the formal clause by clause. So members, that concludes the informal consideration. Next week on the bill, from the department. We will be doing the formal clause, notwithstanding the area on clause 9 that we're going to have an update on, and clauses 11 and 17, which deal with the 16 and 17-year-old issue. That will have some further information for that meeting. Christine, is Veronica free to go? Yeah. Okay, so can I thank the department officials for being here and your advice on this? Thank you. Okay, members, just a few more updates on this aspect. At our meeting on the 3rd of September, the committee agreed to request clarity from the PSNI on the rationale for following the National Police Chiefs Council guidance on the approach to sharing information with the Home Office where a victim or witness of crime is also a suspected immigration offender in the context of domestic abuse. The committee agreed to request the views of the Policing Board on the matter. PSNI and Police Board have responded. That correspondence is in the tabled pack. The police stated that it ordinarily adopts NPCC guidance in order to ensure where possible it applies the same policing operating principles as GB colleagues. It also outlines the legal obligations to share such information when it comes to light, but highlights the NPCC guidance. Also states that immigration rules do allow for a victim of domestic violence to apply independently of their spouse for indefinite leave to remain before the end of the minimum period if they can produce evidence that the relationship broke down as a result of domestic violence. It explains that it encourages all victims of domestic abuse to report it to the police, and their primary concern will be to safeguard them and, where the evidence exists, bring offenders to justice. The Policing Board has advised that it has not considered the matter previously. It will consider the PSNI response at its meeting on the 1st of October and will advise if any issues arise, so that information is there for members to note. I know some members had asked for information in respect of that. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, members. Other issues not currently covered in the bill then, in terms of amendments and so on that we've been dealing with. The committee discussed the range of other issues raised in the evidence received that are not currently covered by the Domestic Abuse and Family Proceedings Bill at our meeting on the 17th of September. Requested additional information from the Department of Justice and Communities on some of them. The committee also identified a range of issues that it wished to discuss further with the Bill Clerk, Stephanie Mallon, to inform decisions on whether amendments should be brought forward to make legislative provision for some or all in the Domestic Abuse and Family Proceedings Bill, and these discussions took place at the meetings on the 17th of September and the 21st of September. Additional information has been provided by the Department, and those responses are in the tabled pack. Most of the information will inform the discussions relating to potential amendments. The Department has responded to the assertion by the Children's Law Centre that the equality screening undertaken as part of the consultation on the policy proposals in 2015-16 no longer stands, given that clauses 11 and 17 now exclude many under 18s, and the Department is required to carry out an equality screening exercise, a full impact assessment, consultation and proposed mitigation, otherwise it will have breached Section 75 duty. The Department has stated that the provisions in the bill were rescreened prior to the bill's introduction to the Assembly in March. This rescreening exercise noted the Department did not intend that the new offence would include parental abuse or neglect, as this falls under child protection provisions, but that the new offence and other provisions would apply and be accessible equally to all groups of individuals. This would include, for example, a person under 18 being abused by a sibling, as well as abuse within teenage relationships. It was therefore considered that there was no evidence to indicate that under 18s would be adversely affected by the provisions. The Department is now proposing to amend the child cruelty offence in Section 20 of the Children and Young Persons Act 68, making clear that non-physical ill-treatment of a child by someone with parental responsibility for them is an offence, as discussed earlier. The Department has also indicated that it will rescreen the provisions in the bill to take account of any amendments that are accepted. The Department has also provided a list of issues that the Department intends to include in the Justice Miscellaneous Provisions Bill. These are substantial and can be found in Annex A to the Department's letter dated the 23rd of September. So, members, that information is there for noting unless there's further information required. So the Bill Clerk, Stephanie Mallon, has provided a text of potential amendments as instructed by the committee, and these were emailed to members and have been provided in hard copy to the meeting. And in accordance with normal protocol, this session will be taking place in a closed format. So we will close the meeting.
Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate